Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Edward I, a king whose towering presence literally and figuratively shaped the destiny of Britain. Edward I, often called Longshanks for his remarkable height, ruled England from 1272 to 1307 during one of the most transformative periods in English history. Picture, if you will, a man who stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall in an age when most people barely reached 5.5 feet. Imagine the awe and fear he must have inspired simply by walking into a room, his golden crown catching the flickering light of medieval torches, his steely blue eyes surveying all before him with the calculating gaze of a born ruler. This was Edward I, a king who would reshape the very foundations of Britain, yet whose methods would leave scars that endured for centuries. This king was a contradiction wrapped in royal robes, a brilliant lawmaker who created the foundations of modern England, yet also one of history's most ruthless conquerors. He strengthened Parliament, reformed the legal system, and brought order to a chaotic realm. But his iron fist also crushed Wales beneath stone castles, terrorized Scotland with relentless campaigns, and expelled an entire people from England's shores in one of medieval Europe's most shocking acts of persecution. Edward's story is one of breathtaking ambition and cold calculation, of legal genius and military brutality, of a king who genuinely believed that order justified any means necessary to achieve it. Tonight, we'll explore how this towering figure built the English state as we know it, while breaking nations and peoples who dared to resist his vision of unified rule. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Perhaps you visited one of Edward's magnificent castles in Wales, those incredible fortresses that still dominate the landscape 7 centuries later. Maybe you've walked through the halls of Westminster, where Edward held his famous model parliament. Or perhaps you simply have thoughts about how leaders throughout history have balanced strength with justice, conquest with governance. Don't be shy. Our Sleepy Crown community is wonderfully warm and welcoming, and we genuinely enjoy reading every comment you share. Your insights often spark fascinating discussions that enrich all our understanding of these remarkable historical figures. And if this gentle journey through medieval England helps you find rest, please give this video a like and consider subscribing too. Join our growing family of history lovers who find peace in the past. We're always crafting new stories from history's most fascinating corners, designed to carry you peacefully towards sleep while feeding your curiosity about the remarkable people who shaped our world. So settle into your most comfortable position, perhaps pulling a soft blanket up to your chin. Close your eyes and let the soft whispers of 13th century England carry you toward restful sleep. Tonight, we'll explore how one man's iron will and towering ambition built a nation while breaking others, and how his complex legacy continues to shape Britain and influence the world even today. Edward, later known as King Edward I of England, entered the world on a warm summer night in June 1239 at Westminster Palace, his first cries echoing through the stone corridors of royal power. Outside those palace walls, England was already stirring with the tensions and conflicts that would define not just his childhood, but his entire approach to kingship. His father, Henry III, ruled over a kingdom fractured by baronial disputes, drained by costly foreign adventures, and weakened by the king's own indecisive character. The infant prince was born into luxury, yet also into uncertainty. The royal nursery at Westminster was filled with the finest tapestries depicting scenes of heroic knights and noble deeds. Yet just beyond those decorated walls, real knights were plotting against his father's rule. silver cups and golden rattles surrounded the baby prince, but the royal treasury was nearly empty, drained by Henry's expensive and largely unsuccessful attempts to reclaim his family's lost lands in France. Edward's mother, Eleanor of Provence, brought a different flavour to the English court. She arrived from the sophisticated courts of southern France, where troubadours sang of courtly love, and nobles prided themselves on refined manners and cultural achievement. Eleanor introduced her son to a world beyond the rough and tumble politics of medieval England, a realm of poetry, music, and intellectual discourse that would influence Edward's character in unexpected ways throughout his life. From his earliest days, young Edward displayed the physical vigour that would become legendary. Palace chroniclers noted with wonder how quickly the prince grew, how eagerly he took to physical activities, and how, even as a small child, he seemed to command attention from adults. By the age of 5, he was already noticeably taller than other children his age, and his tutors reported that he possessed an unusual combination of physical courage and mental acuity. The prince's education was comprehensive and demanding, befitting a future king in an age when royal authority depended as much on personal capability as on divine right. Edward learned to read and write in Latin, the language of scholarship and diplomacy. He studied the chronicles of past English kings, learning about the glorious reigns of the Henrys and the tragic failures of weaker monarchs. His tutors made sure he understood that kingship was not just about wearing a crown. It was about earning the respect and loyalty of nobles who commanded their own armies and controlled vast estates. Military training began early, as it must in an age when kings were expected to lead their armies personally into battle. Young Edward learned to handle sword and shield, to ride a warhorse with skill and confidence, and to understand the complex tactics that could mean the difference between victory and defeat on medieval battlefields. But perhaps more importantly, he learned to read men's faces, to detect loyalty or treachery in a glance, and to project the kind of authority that could inspire followers or intimidate enemies. The political education of Prince Edward was provided not by books alone, but by the constant drama unfolding around his father's troubled reign. Henry III was a man of good intentions but poor judgment, prone to expensive projects and easily influenced by foreign advisors who seemed more interested in enriching themselves than in strengthening England. Young Edward watched as his father's weaknesses invited challenge after challenge from the powerful barons who controlled much of England's wealth and military strength. The most formative influence on Edward's early years was undoubtedly the growing crisis between his father and Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. De Montfort was a fascinating and complex figure, a French nobleman who had married into the English royal family and become one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. He was also Edward's uncle by marriage, which made the growing conflict all the more personal and painful for the young prince. De Montfort represented something new and dangerous in English politics, a noble who justified rebellion not merely for personal gain, but in the name of reform and good governance. He argued that the king's power should be limited by law, that royal advisors should be chosen for their competence rather than their nationality or family connections, and that the great nobles of England should have a formal voice in how the kingdom was governed. These ideas would eventually evolve into the foundations of parliamentary government, but in the 1250s and 1260s, they represented a direct challenge to everything Henry III understood about royal authority. Young Edward found himself caught between loyalty to his father and grudging admiration for his uncle's political vision. De Montfort was everything Henry III was not: decisive, charismatic, militarily competent, and genuinely concerned with effective governance. The Earl also showed special attention to his young nephew. perhaps recognizing in Edward the potential for greatness that seemed absent in Henry. In 1254, when Edward was 15, his father arranged his marriage to Eleanor of Castile, a political alliance designed to strengthen England's position in its ongoing conflicts with France. The marriage negotiations also gave Edward his first independent command, as Henry III granted him control over Gascony, Ireland, and parts of Wales. For a teenager, this was an enormous responsibility. These territories were among England's most valuable possessions, but they were also among the most difficult to govern. Eleanor of Castile proved to be far more than just a political alliance. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and genuinely devoted to her husband's interests. Unlike many royal marriages of the era, which were purely business arrangements tolerated by both parties, Edward and Eleanor developed a genuine partnership that would last throughout their lives. Eleanor would become not just Edward's wife, but one of his most trusted advisors and closest companions. The marriage also brought Edward his first taste of the challenges he would face as king. Gascony was technically an English possession, but it was surrounded by French territory and constantly threatened by French expansion. The local nobles were notoriously independent and prone to switching sides whenever it suited their interests. Ireland was even more complex, a patchwork of English settlements, native Irish kingdoms, and Anglo-Norman lordships that maintained only nominal loyalty to the English crown. Wales presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The Welsh princes had never fully accepted English overlordship, and they skillfully exploited every sign of English weakness to expand their own power and territory. When Edward attempted to assert more direct control over his Welsh lands, he encountered fierce resistance from Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, who styled himself Prince of Wales and commanded the loyalty of most native Welsh nobles. These early experiences in governance taught Edward crucial lessons that would shape his entire approach to kingship. He learned that ruling distant territories required more than just royal decree. It demanded physical presence, local knowledge, and often the careful application of force. He discovered that the loyalty of subordinates could never be taken for granted, and that effective rule required constant vigilance and the ability to respond quickly to emerging threats. Perhaps most importantly, Edward learned that weakness invited challenge, while strength, properly applied, could create the stability necessary for effective governance. This lesson would guide his actions throughout his reign, sometimes leading to brilliant successes, but also to some of the darkest chapters in English history. The 1260s brought the greatest test of Edward's young life when the simmering conflict between his father and Simon de Montfort erupted into open civil war. The Second Barons' War, as historians would later call it, was more than just another noble rebellion. It was a struggle over the fundamental nature of English government and the limits of royal power. Initially, Edward found himself torn between family loyalty and his own political instincts. De Montfort's reforms made sense. They promised to create a more efficient and accountable system of government, but they also threatened to diminish royal authority and establish precedents that could hobble future kings. For a young man destined to wear the crown, this was a deeply personal dilemma. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, where Edward learned one of the harshest lessons of his life. Leading the right wing of his father's army, the young prince fought with tremendous courage and initial success, scattering the London militia that opposed him. But in his eagerness to pursue the fleeing enemy, Edward left the main battlefield undefended. When he returned, he found that his father's forces had been defeated, and both he and Henry III were prisoners of the rebels. The months that followed were among the most humiliating of Edward's life, but also among the most educational. As a prisoner of Simon de Montfort, he observed firsthand how effective governance actually worked. De Montfort was not content merely to defeat his enemies. He sought to create institutions that could govern England more effectively than the chaotic system that had prevailed under Henry III. The Earl's innovations included expanding the role of Parliament to include not just the great nobles and churchmen, but also representatives from the towns and counties. This model parliament gave a voice to the emerging middle classes, merchants, lawyers, and substantial farmers who controlled much of England's wealth, but had previously been excluded from political power. Edward watched and learned as de Montfort demonstrated that effective government required not just the consent of the mighty, but the cooperation of the capable. But Edward also observed the limitations of de Montfort's approach. The Earl's reforms were admirable in theory, but they depended ultimately on his personal authority and charisma. When that authority was challenged, the entire system began to unravel. Edward learned that institutional change, however necessary, was worthless without the power to enforce it. In May 1265, Edward managed to escape from his captivity through a combination of wit and daring that became legendary. The story, as told by medieval chroniclers, describes how the prince convinced his guards to let him test a series of horses outside Hereford Castle. He rode each horse in turn, praising their qualities while gradually moving further from the castle. When he mounted the last and fastest horse, he suddenly spurred it forward and raced away to freedom, leaving his shocked guards behind. Whether the escape happened exactly as the chroniclers described is less important than what Edward did with his freedom. Rather than simply seeking revenge, he demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his entire reign. He carefully gathered support from nobles who had remained loyal to his father, negotiated alliances with former enemies who had grown disillusioned with de Montfort's rule, and planned a campaign designed not just to win battles, but to restore stable government to England. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, where Edward demonstrated both his military genius and his ruthless determination. Using superior tactics and carefully chosen terrain, he trapped de Montfort's army and destroyed it completely. The Earl himself was killed in the fighting, and his body was subsequently mutilated by Edward's soldiers, a grim indication of the prince's understanding that some enemies must be not merely defeated, but eliminated so thoroughly that they could never rise again. The victory at Evesham established Edward as the real power in England, even though his father technically remained king. Henry III, weakened by years of conflict and showing signs of premature aging, increasingly relied on his son to manage the day-to-day business of government. This transition period allowed Edward to put into practice the lessons he had learned during the Civil War, gradually implementing reforms that strengthened royal authority while incorporating some of de Montfort's more useful innovations. The pacification of England after the Civil War revealed Edward's capacity for both strategic thinking and, when necessary, carefully calculated mercy. He understood that crushing the rebellion was only the first step. True victory required reconciliation with former enemies and the establishment of a more stable system of governance. Rather than simply executing all the rebels, Edward offered terms that allowed most of them to keep their lands and titles in exchange for genuine submission to royal authority. This policy of reconciliation was not motivated by sentiment, but by cold political calculation. Edward recognized that England needed the skills and resources of men who had opposed his father, and that excluding them permanently from government would only create a source of future instability. By offering a path back to royal favor, he transformed potential enemies into grateful supporters while demonstrating that rebellion, though it might be forgiven, would never be forgotten. In 1270, Edward embarked on what would be his only crusade, joining the expedition to the Holy Land led by King Louis IX of France. This decision reflected both his genuine religious conviction and his shrewd understanding of European politics. Crusading was still considered the highest form of Christian knighthood, and success in the Holy Land would enhance Edward's reputation throughout Europe. The crusade itself was largely unsuccessful in military terms. The great age of crusading conquest was long past, and the Muslim forces commanded by skilled leaders like Baibars were more than a match for the divided and often poorly supplied Christian armies. But for Edward personally, the expedition was invaluable. He learned about different military techniques, encountered new architectural styles that would later influence his castle-building programs, and established diplomatic contacts that would serve him throughout his reign. The crusade also provided Edward with opportunities to demonstrate the personal courage and determination that would become legendary. The most famous incident occurred when he was nearly assassinated in Acre by a member of the feared assassin sect. According to the chronicles, Edward was in his tent when an assassin approached, pretending to bring a message. As the man drew a poisoned dagger, Edward's quick reflexes and superior strength allowed him to overpower his attacker, though not before receiving a wound that nearly proved fatal. The story of Eleanor of Castile sucking the poison from her husband's wound to save his life is probably a later romantic invention, but it perfectly captured how Edward and Eleanor were perceived by their contemporaries, as a royal couple bound together by genuine affection and mutual loyalty. Whether or not the specific details are accurate, Edward's survival of the assassination attempt became part of his legend, demonstrating that he was a man who could not be easily defeated or intimidated. When news reached Edward in 1272 that his father had died, he was still in the Holy Land, slowly recovering from his wounds and completing his crusading obligations. Unlike previous royal successions, there was no rush to return to England immediately. Edward's authority was so well established, and the realm was so stable after years of his effective governance that he could afford to complete his affairs in the East and make a leisurely journey home. This confidence proved entirely justified. The great nobles of England had already sworn allegiance to Edward, and the kingdom's administrative machinery continued to function smoothly under the direction of capable officials like Robert Burnell. When Edward finally returned to England in August 1274, he found a stable kingdom ready to welcome its new king with genuine enthusiasm. The coronation of Edward I at Westminster Abbey on August 19th, 1274, marked not just the beginning of a new reign, but the start of one of the most transformative periods in English history. The prince, who had learned hard lessons about power, loyalty, and leadership through civil war, foreign adventure, and practical governance, was ready to reshape his kingdom according to his own vision of what England could and should become. The newly crowned Edward I faced a kingdom that bore the visible and invisible scars of decades of internal conflict, financial mismanagement, and inconsistent governance. England in 1274 was like a magnificent house that had been neglected by its previous owners. The basic structure was sound, but virtually every system needed attention, repair, or complete rebuilding. The realm possessed vast potential, but that potential was hobbled by a bewildering maze of contradictory laws, rebellious nobles who had grown accustomed to near independence, and financial institutions that seemed designed more to enrich royal officials than to serve the crown's needs. Edward understood from his first day as king that his reign would be defined not by grand gestures or dramatic conquests, but by the patient, methodical work of reform and consolidation. He had observed during his father's troubled reign how weakness invited challenge, how inconsistency bred contempt, and how good intentions without effective implementation were worse than useless. The new king was determined to project strength from the very beginning of his reign. while avoiding the trap of appearing tyrannical or arbitrary in his exercise of power. The challenge was enormous. Henry III had left behind a royal government that functioned more like a collection of competing fiefdoms than a unified administration. Different officials operated under different rules. Local customs varied wildly from one region to another, and the relationship between royal authority and baronial privilege remained dangerously undefined. Corruption was endemic, with royal officials at every level treating their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. Edward's first major decision as king revealed both his strategic thinking and his understanding of political reality. Rather than sweeping away all of his father's appointees and starting fresh, he chose to retain many experienced administrators while gradually introducing his own trusted advisors into key positions. This approach allowed him to benefit from institutional knowledge while ensuring that real power rested with men who shared his vision of stronger, more efficient royal government. The appointment of Robert Burnell as Chancellor exemplified Edward's approach to building an effective administration. Burnell was not a great noble with vast estates and ancient lineage. He was a capable bureaucrat who had proven his worth through years of faithful service. He understood both the theoretical principles of good governance and the practical challenges of implementing reform in a complex, tradition-bound society. Most importantly, he shared Edward's belief that royal authority needed to be strengthened through better organization, rather than mere assertion of power. Under Burnell's guidance, the royal chancery was transformed from a chaotic collection of clerks and scribes into something resembling a modern civil service. New procedures were established for handling correspondence, maintaining records, and ensuring that royal commands were actually carried out. The innovations might seem mundane compared to the dramatic events of warfare and conquest, but they were crucial for building the kind of sustained royal authority that could survive changes of personnel and resist the corrosive effects of local interests. One of Edward's first major initiatives was addressing the chaos that passed for a legal system in medieval England. The realm operated under what could charitably be called a patchwork of jurisdictions. Royal courts competed with baronial courts, which competed with ecclesiastical courts, which competed with various local and customary tribunals. The same dispute might be heard by different courts reaching different conclusions, while clever litigants learned to shop for the jurisdiction most likely to favor their case. This legal confusion was more than just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental threat to royal authority and social stability. If people could not rely on consistent, predictable justice, they would inevitably turn to private force or personal connections to resolve their disputes. The result was a society where might made right and where the poor and powerless had little hope of fair treatment. Edward approached legal reform with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all his administrative initiatives. Rather than attempting to impose an entirely new legal system overnight, he sought to clarify and codify existing practices, while strengthening royal oversight and eliminating the most obvious sources of corruption and inefficiency. The process would take years to complete, but the foundations were laid in his first great legislative achievement, the Statute of Westminster, enacted in 1275. This comprehensive law addressed dozens of specific legal problems while establishing broader principles that would guide English jurisprudence for centuries. The statute clarified property rights, standardized inheritance procedures, reformed criminal law, and established new mechanisms for ensuring that royal justice was both accessible and effective. Perhaps most importantly, it asserted the principle that royal law should take precedence over local customs and baronial privileges when conflicts arose. The statute also tackled the persistent problem of corruption among local officials. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and other royal representatives had developed an unsavory reputation for abusing their positions, extorting money from local populations while failing to enforce royal law effectively. Edward's reforms established clearer guidelines for official conduct, created mechanisms for investigating and punishing abuse, and gradually began rebuilding public trust in royal justice. The financial challenges facing Edward's government were even more complex than the legal ones. Henry III's reign had left the royal treasury in a parlous state, depleted by expensive and largely unsuccessful foreign adventures, grandiose building projects, and a tax system that seemed designed to maximize noble resentment while minimizing actual revenue. Edward needed to find new sources of income without alienating the very nobles whose support he required for the effective governance. The king's approach to financial reform demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the delicate relationship between royal authority and noble consent. Rather than simply demanding more money through arbitrary taxation, Edward worked to make the existing tax system more efficient and equitable while building support for necessary increases through careful political management. He also recognized that transparency in government spending could help justify the need for increased revenue, a remarkably modern insight that would prove crucial for the development of parliamentary oversight. Edward's early experiments with taxation revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of royal power in medieval England. He could impose certain traditional dues and customs duties without seeking formal consent, but any significant new taxes required the approval of the great nobles assembled in Parliament. This meant that successful financial policy depended as much on political skill as on administrative efficiency. The king's approach to managing this challenge would evolve throughout his reign, but the basic principles were established early. Edward would seek to justify new taxes by demonstrating their necessity for the common good, particularly for national defense. He would involve noble representatives in decisions about how tax money was spent, giving them a sense of ownership in government policy, and he would work to ensure that the burden of taxation fell as fairly as possible across different social groups, avoiding the perception that only the poor were being asked to sacrifice for the crown's needs. Foreign policy presented equally complex challenges during Edward's early reign. England's position in European politics was complicated by the king's dual role as an independent sovereign in England and a feudal vassal to the French king for his territories in Gascony. This relationship created constant opportunities for conflict, as French kings periodically attempted to assert greater control over English holdings, while English kings sought to minimize French interference in their continental possessions. Edward's diplomatic skills proved crucial in managing these tensions during his early years as king. He understood that outright confrontation with France would be expensive and potentially disastrous, given France's superior resources and population. At the same time, complete submission to French demands would undermine his authority at home and set dangerous precedents for future relations. Edward's solution involved careful negotiation, strategic concessions, and the gradual strengthening of England's position through internal reform and military modernization. The young king's relationship with Pope Gregory X exemplified his balanced approach to international relations. Edward maintained correct diplomatic relations with Rome, acknowledging papal spiritual authority while firmly defending English interests when they conflicted with papal political demands. This policy helped establish the principle that English kings would cooperate with the papacy, as long as such cooperation did not compromise royal authority or English independence. Religious affairs within England required equally careful attention. The English Church was wealthy, influential, and jealous of its traditional privileges. Edward needed the Church's support for his reform program, but he also had to ensure that ecclesiastical power did not challenge royal supremacy in secular matters. His approach involved cooperation where possible and firm resistance when necessary. The relationship between church and state in medieval England was governed by a complex web of legal precedents, traditional practices, and practical accommodations that had evolved over centuries. Edward's innovation was to clarify this relationship through explicit legislation, rather than leaving everything to custom and negotiation. The Statute of Westminster included provisions defining the respective jurisdictions of church and royal courts, establishing procedures for resolving conflicts between secular and ecclesiastical authorities, and asserting royal authority over certain matters that had previously been considered purely religious. Trade and commerce also demanded royal attention as England's economy continued to evolve throughout the 13th century. The growth of towns, the increasing importance of international trade, and the emergence of new financial instruments all required government responses that had no clear precedents in traditional feudal law. Edward's approach to these challenges revealed his understanding that royal authority needed to adapt to changing economic conditions rather than simply trying to preserve medieval customs that no longer served contemporary needs. The king's early policies toward merchant communities, craft guilds, and trading centres established patterns that would influence English economic development for centuries. Rather than viewing commerce as somehow incompatible with noble values, Edward recognized that trade generated the wealth that made effective government possible. His legislation protected merchants from arbitrary seizure of their goods, established standard weights and measures to facilitate trade, and created legal mechanisms for enforcing commercial contracts. Perhaps most importantly, Edward's early years as king established his reputation as a ruler who combined strength with justice, innovation with respect for tradition, and royal authority with genuine concern for effective governance. The nobles who had grown accustomed to near independence under Henry III gradually learned that the new king would not tolerate defiance, but they also discovered that loyal service would be rewarded and that Edward's demands, however firm, were generally reasonable and consistent with the realm's genuine needs. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Medieval government changed slowly, and Edward would face serious challenges to his authority throughout his reign. But by the end of his first decade as king, England had begun to function as a unified kingdom, rather than a collection of competing jurisdictions. Royal law was becoming supreme throughout the realm. Royal officials were beginning to behave like public servants rather than private entrepreneurs, and the foundations were being laid for the kind of strong, centralized government that would make England a major European power. This patient work of domestic reform might seem less dramatic than the military conquests and international adventures that would dominate the later years of Edward's reign, but it was arguably more important for England's long-term development. The legal, administrative, and financial innovations of Edward's early years created the institutional framework that would allow England to survive and prosper through centuries of internal strife, foreign invasion, and social transformation. They established principles of governance that would influence not just England, but eventually much of the world as English institutions spread through conquest, colonization, and voluntary adoption. The relationship between England and Wales in the 13th century was one of simmering tension punctuated by explosive conflict, like a pot of water that never quite reaches a rolling boil, but occasionally erupts in violent steam. For centuries, the Welsh princes had maintained a precarious independence in their mountainous homeland, playing English kings against each other, exploiting moments of English weakness, and fiercely defending their ancient customs and language against foreign domination. When Edward I turned his attention to Wales in the 1270s, he brought to this ancient conflict a new level of systematic planning and ruthless determination that would change the nature of Anglo-Welsh relations forever. This was not to be another temporary English incursion, that the Welsh could wait out in their mountain strongholds. Edward intended nothing less than the complete subjugation of Wales and the permanent extinction of Welsh independence. The immediate cause of conflict was the defiance of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, who styled himself Prince of Wales and commanded the loyalty of most native Welsh rulers. Llywelyn was a formidable opponent, intelligent, charismatic, and skilled in the guerrilla warfare that had allowed the Welsh to resist English domination for centuries. He controlled not just Gwynedd, the traditional heartland of Welsh resistance, but also extensive territories in central and southern Wales that he had conquered during the chaos of Henry III's reign. Llywelyn's power was based on more than just military success. He had skillfully exploited the legal and diplomatic frameworks of medieval feudalism to legitimize his authority while minimizing his obligations to the English crown. The Treaty of Montgomery, signed in 1267, had recognized Llywelyn as Prince of Wales in exchange for his formal submission to Henry III, but the treaty's terms were ambiguous enough to allow both sides to interpret their obligations differently, creating a situation that was bound to lead to conflict. Edward's approach to the Welsh problem differed fundamentally from that of his predecessors. Previous English kings had been content to extract occasional submissions and tribute payments from Welsh princes, while leaving the basic structure of Welsh society intact. Edward, however, viewed Welsh independence as an affront to royal dignity and a source of potential instability that had to be eliminated permanently. The king's strategy combined military innovation with psychological warfare, administrative reform with cultural suppression. He understood that defeating Welsh armies in battle would be only the first step. True conquest required the destruction of Welsh political institutions, the elimination of the native ruling class, and the implantation of English settlers and customs in place of Welsh traditions. The First Welsh War began in 1277, when Llywelyn refused to attend Edward's coronation or perform the homage required by feudal law. Edward's response was swift and overwhelming. Rather than simply launching another raid into Welsh territory, he organized a systematic campaign designed to cut off Welsh resistance at its source. Edward's military innovations were immediately apparent. Instead of relying solely on the traditional feudal levy, which provided knights for only limited periods of service, he assembled a professional army that included significant numbers of paid soldiers. This force included not just English knights and men-at-arms, but also Welsh infantry recruited from areas already under English control, and experienced crossbowmen from Gascony. The logistical planning for the campaign was equally impressive. Edward established supply depots along his route of advance, arranged for regular delivery of food and equipment from England, and coordinated naval support to prevent Welsh forces from receiving assistance from Ireland or France. This level of organizational sophistication was unprecedented in Welsh warfare and gave Edward enormous advantages over his opponents. The psychological impact of Edward's approach was perhaps even more important than the military advantages. Previous English expeditions into Wales had been relatively small-scale affairs that Welsh forces could reasonably hope to defeat or outlast. Edward's army was so large and so well equipped that it clearly represented a qualitatively different level of threat. The campaign itself unfolded with mechanical precision. Edward's forces advanced along the coast of North Wales, systematically reducing Welsh strongholds while building fortified camps to secure their communications. The Welsh strategy of retreating into the mountains and waiting for the English to withdraw was rendered useless by Edward's evident intention to remain in Wales indefinitely. Llywelyn's position became increasingly desperate as the summer progressed. His attempts to rally support from other Welsh princes met with limited success, as many had already concluded that resistance was futile. By autumn, Llywelyn was trapped in Snowdonia with a dwindling force and no prospect of relief. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, marked the end of meaningful Welsh independence. Llywelyn was permitted to retain the title Prince of Wales, but only as ruler of a small portion of Gwynedd. The rest of his territories were either incorporated directly into the English crown's possessions or granted to English nobles as rewards for their service in the campaign. But Edward's vision of Welsh subjugation extended far beyond military conquest. The real transformation of Wales began with the systematic program of castle building that followed the military victory. These were not ordinary medieval fortifications, but massive stone complexes designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. The castles were, first and foremost, military installations capable of dominating the surrounding countryside and serving as bases for further English expansion. But they were also administrative centres where English law would be enforced, economic hubs that would redirect Welsh trade toward English interests, and cultural symbols designed to demonstrate the permanence and legitimacy of English rule. Edward entrusted the castle building program to Master James of St. George, a brilliant military architect who had previously worked for the Count of Savoy. James brought to Wales the most advanced fortification techniques of his era, including the concentric castle design that provided multiple layers of defence and the latest innovations in siege warfare. The great castles of North Wales, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris, were more than just fortifications. They were carefully planned urban centres designed to implant English culture in the heart of Welsh territory. Each castle was accompanied by a planned town populated by English settlers who were granted special privileges and legal protections. Caernarfon Castle, in particular, was designed to serve as a symbol of Edward's imperial ambitions. Its distinctive polygonal towers were modelled on the walls of Constantinople, deliberately evoking the imagery of imperial Rome. The castle's location was equally symbolic. It was built on the site of the Roman fort of Saguntium, emphasizing the connection between Edward's conquest and the ancient imperial tradition. The town planning that accompanied castle construction revealed the systematic nature of Edward's approach to colonization. English settlers were granted building plots within the town walls, along with trading privileges that gave them significant economic advantages over the native Welsh population. Welsh inhabitants were generally excluded from these new urban centres, creating a clear distinction between the privileged English minority and the subjugated Welsh majority. The legal framework that Edward imposed on conquered Wales was equally systematic. English common law replaced traditional Welsh legal customs in most areas, though some provisions of Welsh law were retained for minor civil disputes. The new legal system was administered by English officials operating from the royal castles, ensuring that justice would reflect English rather than Welsh values and interests. The administrative reorganisation of Wales followed English models, with the conquered territories divided into shires administered by royal sheriffs. This system replaced the traditional Welsh structure of lordships and clan territories with a bureaucratic framework designed to facilitate central control. The new administration was staffed almost entirely by Englishmen, ensuring that Welsh nobles would have no significant role in governing their own people. But the most profound change was cultural. Edward's conquest marked the beginning of a systematic effort to suppress Welsh language, literature, and customs in favour of English alternatives. Welsh bards, who had traditionally served as the keepers of Welsh history and culture, found their patrons eliminated and their role in society increasingly marginalised. The Welsh response to Edward's conquest was initially one of stunned acceptance. The scale and thoroughness of the English victory had been so overwhelming that organised resistance seemed impossible. But the harsh realities of English rule gradually created new sources of resentment and opposition. In 1282, Llywelyn's brother Dafydd launched a new rebellion that quickly spread throughout Wales. This second war was far more brutal than the first, as Edward treated it not as a conflict between rival princes, but as a rebellion against legitimate royal authority. The English response was correspondingly harsh, with systematic destruction of Welsh strongholds and the execution of captured rebels. The death of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd in December 1282 marked the end of the ancient line of Welsh princes. According to contemporary accounts, Llywelyn was killed in a minor skirmish near Builth Wells, his head subsequently displayed on the Tower of London as a warning to other potential rebels. With Llywelyn's death, the last symbol of Welsh independence was extinguished. The capture and execution of Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283 completed Edward's conquest of Wales. Dafydd was tried for treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. The brutal punishment reserved for those who betrayed their feudal obligations. His execution sent a clear message that Welsh resistance would be met with the harshest possible response. The Statute of Rhuddlan, enacted in 1284, formalised Edward's reorganisation of Wales as an English possession. The statute abolished the last vestiges of Welsh autonomy and integrated the conquered territories into the English administrative system. Wales ceased to exist as an independent political entity and became merely a collection of English counties governed from Westminster. The cultural impact of Edward's conquest was profound and lasting. The Welsh language survived, but its status was dramatically reduced. Welsh literature went into decline as the patronage system that had supported bards and scholars was destroyed. Welsh law was largely superseded by English common law, though some customs persisted in remote areas. The economic consequences were equally significant. The new English towns became centres of trade and commerce, but the profits flowed primarily to English settlers rather than Welsh inhabitants. Welsh peasants found themselves subject to new forms of taxation and legal obligation that gradually reduced their economic independence. The psychological impact of conquest was perhaps the most important of all. The Welsh had lost not just their political independence, but their sense of themselves as a distinct people with their own destiny. The ancient prophecies that had sustained Welsh resistance for centuries, particularly the belief that a great Welsh king would one day drive out the foreign invaders, seemed to have been permanently disproven. Yet Edward's conquest of Wales was not as complete as it initially appeared. While he had successfully destroyed Welsh political independence and established English administrative control, he had not succeeded in eliminating Welsh cultural identity. The language, customs, and traditions that defined Welsh society proved more resilient than political institutions. The story of Edward's conquest of Wales reveals both the king's extraordinary capabilities and the limitations of medieval royal power. He had demonstrated remarkable organizational skill, strategic vision, and ruthless determination in achieving his military objectives. His castle-building program and administrative reforms created a framework for English control that would endure for centuries. But Edward had also created new forms of resentment and opposition that would trouble English rule for generations to come. The systematic exclusion of the Welsh from positions of authority in their own country, the economic privileges granted to English settlers, and the suppression of Welsh culture created grievances that would periodically erupt into rebellion throughout the medieval period. The conquest of Wales marked a crucial step in Edward's larger project of creating a unified British kingdom under English rule. It demonstrated his ability to plan and execute complex military campaigns, to build lasting administrative structures, and to use architecture and urban planning as tools of political control. These skills would prove crucial in his subsequent attempts to conquer Scotland and his ongoing efforts to strengthen royal authority within England itself. Perhaps most importantly, the Welsh conquest revealed Edward's fundamental approach to kingship, his belief that royal authority could and should be absolute, that resistance to legitimate royal commands was not just rebellion, but treason, and that the price of defiance should be so high that no rational person would consider paying it. These principles would guide Edward's actions throughout his reign, leading to both remarkable achievements and terrible tragedies. In the quiet halls of Westminster, away from the clash of swords and the thunder of war horses, Edward I was fighting a different kind of battle, one that would prove far more lasting than any military conquest. This was the battle to create a legal system worthy of a great kingdom, to transform England from a patchwork of competing jurisdictions and ancient customs into a unified realm governed by consistent, rational law. The legal landscape that Edward inherited was a bewildering maze that would challenge even the most determined reformer. England in 1274 operated under what could generously be called a system of legal pluralism, but which more accurately resembled organized chaos. Royal courts competed with baronial courts. Ecclesiastical courts asserted jurisdiction over matters that secular authorities claimed, and local customs varied so dramatically from one region to another that the same action might be perfectly legal in one shire and punishable by death in the next. This legal confusion was more than just an administrative inconvenience. It was a fundamental threat to the very concept of unified royal authority. If the king's law could not be consistently applied throughout his realm, if subjects could shop for favorable jurisdictions like merchants haggling in a marketplace, then royal authority itself became merely one option among many, rather than the supreme governing principle of the kingdom. Edward's approach to legal reform revealed the methodical intelligence that characterized all his greatest achievements. Rather than attempting to sweep away centuries of accumulated legal tradition and impose an entirely new system, he chose to work within existing frameworks while gradually asserting royal supremacy and eliminating the most obvious sources of confusion and abuse. The king's first great legislative achievement, the Statute of Westminster, enacted in 1275, represented years of careful preparation and consultation. Edward had learned from his father's mistakes that royal commands without baronial support were worthless, so he worked closely with leading nobles and churchmen to build consensus around the need for legal reform. The statute addressed dozens of specific legal problems that had been festering for decades. It clarified the relationships between different types of courts, established procedures for appealing decisions from local to royal tribunals, and created mechanisms for ensuring that royal justice was accessible even to subjects of modest means. Perhaps most importantly, it asserted the principle that royal law should take precedence over local customs when conflicts arose. One of the most significant provisions of the statute dealt with property rights, the foundation of medieval society, and the source of endless disputes. The law clarified inheritance procedures, established rules for the transfer of land, and created safeguards against fraudulent claims. These provisions might seem technical and mundane, but they provided the legal security that was essential for economic development and social stability. The statute also tackled the persistent problem of corruption among royal officials. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and other local representatives of royal authority had developed an unsavory reputation for treating their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. The new law established clearer guidelines for official conduct, created procedures for investigating complaints against royal officers, and imposed severe penalties for abuse of authority. But Edward's legal reforms extended far beyond a single statute, however comprehensive. Throughout the 1270s and 1280s, he presided over what amounted to a complete reconstruction of English law. The Second Statute of Westminster, enacted in 1285, addressed additional problems that had emerged as the first reforms were implemented. The Statute of Winchester, passed the same year, revolutionized the system of maintaining public order by requiring local communities to take responsibility for law enforcement. Perhaps the most far-reaching of Edward's legal innovations was the development of what would later be called English common law, a unified system of legal principles that applied throughout the realm, regardless of local customs or traditions. This was not simply a matter of imposing uniform rules, but of creating a coherent intellectual framework that could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining consistency and predictability. The creation of common law required the development of new institutions and procedures. Edward expanded the royal court system, creating specialized tribunals for different types of cases and establishing clear hierarchies of appeal. He also revolutionized legal education by encouraging the establishment of schools where aspiring lawyers could study the principles and procedures of royal law. The Inns of Court, which emerged during Edward's reign as centers of legal education and professional development, represented a remarkable innovation in medieval society. These institutions created a professional class of lawyers who owed their primary loyalty to the crown rather than to local nobles or ecclesiastical authorities. This legal profession became one of the most important pillars of royal authority, providing the expertise necessary to implement complex reforms and the institutional continuity that allowed royal policy to survive changes of personnel. Edward's approach to legal reform also revealed his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between law and politics. He recognized that legal changes could not be imposed by royal decree alone. They required the support of the people who would have to live under the new system. His reforms were therefore designed to provide genuine benefits to ordinary subjects while strengthening royal authority. The expansion of royal justice, for example, was popular because it offered ordinary people access to courts that were generally more honest and efficient than local alternatives. The standardization of weights and measures facilitated trade and commerce while reducing opportunities for fraud. The clarification of property rights provided security for landowners while establishing royal oversight of land transfers. But Edward's legal reforms were not motivated solely by abstract principles of justice or administrative efficiency. They were also calculated to strengthen royal authority at the expense of potential rivals. The assertion of royal supremacy in legal matters reduced the power of local nobles, who had previously administered justice in their own territories according to their own interests. The expansion of royal courts provided the crown with new sources of revenue while creating institutional mechanisms for monitoring and controlling local communities. The Statute of Mortmain, enacted in 1279, exemplified Edward's strategic use of legal reform to advance royal interests. This law prohibited the transfer of land to religious institutions without royal permission, addressing the problem of valuable properties being removed from the royal tax base through pious donations. The statute was presented as a measure to prevent fraud and ensure proper religious observance, but its real purpose was to maintain royal control over the kingdom's economic resources. Edward's treatment of ecclesiastical jurisdiction revealed both his political skill and his determination to assert royal supremacy in all areas of governance. The relationship between church and state had been a source of conflict throughout medieval Europe, with ecclesiastical authorities claiming exclusive jurisdiction over certain matters, while secular rulers sought to limit church power. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation with the church, Edward chose to clarify the respective jurisdictions of secular and ecclesiastical courts through careful legislation. The Statute of Westminster included provisions that limited church courts to matters that were genuinely spiritual in nature, while asserting royal authority over criminal cases involving clerics. This approach allowed Edward to strengthen royal power while avoiding the kind of dramatic conflicts with church authorities that had troubled previous reigns. The long-term impact of Edward's legal reforms cannot be overstated. The system of common law that he established became the foundation not just of English jurisprudence, but of legal systems throughout the English-speaking world. The principles of legal uniformity, royal supremacy, and professional administration that Edward established influenced the development of law in countries as diverse as the United States, Australia, and India. Perhaps even more importantly, Edward's reforms established the precedent that law could be deliberately reformed and improved through royal initiative, working in cooperation with parliamentary consent. This principle would prove crucial for England's later constitutional development, providing a mechanism for peaceful legal change that helped the kingdom avoid the revolutionary upheavals that plagued other European countries. The administrative innovations that accompanied Edward's legal reforms were equally significant. The expansion of royal bureaucracy, the development of professional civil service, and the creation of systematic record-keeping procedures transformed the nature of medieval government. These changes made it possible for royal authority to be exercised consistently throughout the realm, while providing the administrative capacity necessary for implementing complex policies. The establishment of regular judicial circuits, where royal judges travelled throughout the kingdom to hear cases and ensure uniform application of royal law, represented a particularly important innovation. This system brought royal justice directly to local communities, while providing central authorities with detailed information about conditions throughout the realm. The circuit judges became the crown's eyes and ears in the provinces, reporting on everything from local political developments to economic conditions. Edward's legal reforms also had profound social implications. The expansion of royal justice provided new opportunities for social mobility. As legal expertise became increasingly valuable, and professional lawyers could rise to positions of influence regardless of their noble birth, the standardization of legal procedures reduced the importance of personal connections and local influence in determining legal outcomes, creating a more merit-based system of dispute resolution. The economic impact of legal reform was equally significant. The establishment of consistent rules for commercial transactions facilitated trade and encouraged investment by reducing the legal uncertainties that had previously plagued business relationships. The protection of property rights encouraged agricultural improvement and urban development by ensuring that landowners could benefit from their investments. But Edward's legal reforms were not without their critics and limitations. The assertion of royal supremacy over local customs and traditions was resented by many nobles who had previously exercised quasi-independent authority in their own territories. The expansion of royal bureaucracy created new opportunities for corruption and abuse, even as it reduced other forms of legal irregularity. The cost of legal reform was also substantial. The expansion of royal courts, the employment of professional administrators, and the maintenance of judicial circuits required significant financial resources at a time when the Crown was already struggling to fund military campaigns and administrative expansion. Edward's legal reforms, therefore, contributed to the financial pressures that would create political tensions later in his reign. Despite these limitations, Edward's legal reforms represented one of the most successful and enduring aspects of his reign. The system of law that he established provided England with the institutional framework necessary for effective governance, while creating principles and procedures that would influence legal development for centuries to come. The combination of royal authority and legal consistency that Edward achieved became a model for other European kingdoms and contributed significantly to England's emergence as a major European power. In the autumn of 1290, as the first chill winds of winter began to sweep across England, Ships crowded with desperate human cargo departed from English ports bound for France and other continental destinations. These vessels carried approximately 4,000 Jewish men, women, and children, the entire Jewish population of England, into permanent exile. Behind them, they left the only homeland most had ever known. Their properties confiscated, their communities destroyed, their very presence declared incompatible with Christian England by royal decree. This mass expulsion, ordered by Edward I through the Edict of Expulsion, issued on July 18, 1290, represented one of the most comprehensive acts of ethnic cleansing in medieval European history. It was also one of the most calculated and deliberate policies of Edward's reign, reflecting both the anti-Semitic prejudices of medieval Christian society and the cold political calculations of a king who saw the Jewish community as both a source of immediate financial benefit and a long-term political liability. To understand the full horror and significance of this event, we must first examine the complex and increasingly precarious position of Jews in medieval England. The Jewish community had arrived in England shortly after the Norman Conquest, invited by William the Conqueror and his successors, who recognized their value as a source of financial expertise and capital in an economy that largely prohibited Christians from lending money at interest. For nearly 2 centuries, England's Jews had occupied a unique and increasingly uncomfortable position in medieval society. They were technically under royal protection, which meant that they and their property belonged directly to the crown. This status provided some security against local persecution, but it also made them vulnerable to royal exploitation in ways that other subjects were not. The Jewish community had developed into a crucial component of England's medieval economy, operating from major towns like London, York, Norwich, and Lincoln. Jewish financiers provided the credit that made possible everything from major construction projects to international trade. They lent money to nobles for military campaigns, to merchants for commercial ventures, and to farmers for seasonal expenses. Without Jewish capital, much of medieval England's economic activity would have been impossible. But this economic role also made Jews the target of growing resentment and suspicion. Debtors naturally resented their creditors, and when those creditors belonged to a religious minority that was already viewed with suspicion by Christian society, economic antagonism easily transformed into religious hatred. The Church's teaching that usury was sinful, even when practiced by those who were not bound by Christian law, created an atmosphere in which Jewish money lending was seen as both necessary and morally corrupting. Edward's grandfather, Henry III, had already begun the process of systematically exploiting and oppressing the Jewish community. Special taxes were imposed on Jews that were far heavier than those levied on Christian subjects. Jewish property was subject to arbitrary confiscation, and Jewish legal rights were progressively restricted. By the time Edward came to the throne, England's Jews were already a weakened and vulnerable community. Edward's early policies toward the Jews reflected the same systematic approach that characterized all his governance. Rather than simply continuing his father's ad hoc exploitation, he developed a comprehensive strategy designed to extract maximum economic benefit from the Jewish community, while gradually preparing for their eventual elimination as a factor in English society. The Statute of the Jury, enacted in 1275, represented the first major step in this process, ostensibly designed to encourage Jews to abandon money lending and engage in other occupations. The statute actually made it virtually impossible for Jews to earn a living through legitimate means. Money lending was prohibited, but Jews were also excluded from most crafts and trades by guild restrictions and Christian prejudice. The statute required Jews to wear distinctive badges identifying their religion, making them visible targets for harassment and violence. It also prohibited Jews from living in towns where they had not previously been established, effectively confining them to existing communities and preventing the expansion or renewal of Jewish settlement. These restrictions created a vicious cycle of impoverishment and desperation within the Jewish community. Unable to practice their traditional occupations and excluded from new opportunities, many Jews were forced into marginal activities that often brought them into conflict with royal law. Some turned to coin clipping, the practice of shaving small amounts of precious metal from coins before spending them. Others became involved in illegal trade or fraud. Edward's response to these predictable consequences of his own policies was swift and ruthless. In 1278, he ordered the arrest of the heads of all Jewish households in England on charges of coin clipping and other currency violations. The trials that followed were little more than judicial theatre, with predetermined outcomes designed to justify the systematic confiscation of Jewish property. Approximately 300 Jews were executed in connection with these charges, roughly 1/10 of the entire Jewish population of England. The legal proceedings were marked by the use of torture to extract confessions, the denial of basic legal rights, and the application of punishments that were disproportionate even by medieval standards. The Crown confiscated property worth at least £16,000, an enormous sum that represented a significant portion of the total wealth of England's Jewish community. The trials and executions of 1278 to 79 effectively destroyed the economic foundation of Jewish life in England. Those who survived lost most of their property and were left with few means of supporting themselves. The psychological impact was equally devastating, as the Jewish community realized that their royal protection could be withdrawn at any moment, and that their lives and property were entirely at the mercy of royal whim. Edward's final assault on England's Jewish community began in 1287 with a new round of arbitrary arrests and property confiscations. This time, the charges were even more obviously fabricated, and the legal proceedings were conducted with open contempt for any pretense of justice. The message was clear. The king had decided that the Jewish community had outlived its usefulness, and that their remaining wealth would be extracted before their final elimination. The Edict of Expulsion, when it finally came in 1290, was presented as an act of Christian piety, designed to purify England of the moral corruption associated with Jewish usury. Edward claimed that he was acting in honor of the crucified and for the spiritual welfare of his Christian subjects. The edict was carefully timed to coincide with negotiations with Parliament over a substantial new tax grant, suggesting that the expulsion was at least partly motivated by the king's desire to curry favor with his Christian subjects. The practical arrangements for the expulsion revealed the systematic brutality that characterized Edward's approach to the Jewish question. Jews were given until November 1st, 1290, All Saints' Day, to leave England, taking only their movable property with them. All real estate, outstanding debts, and other fixed assets were confiscated by the Crown. Jews who remained beyond the deadline would face execution. The choice of All Saints' Day as the final deadline was particularly cruel, as it meant that Jews would be forced to travel during the dangerous winter season, when seas were rough and roads were nearly impassable. The date also coincided with the Jewish fast of the 9th of Av, which commemorated the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, a symbolic connection that was almost certainly intentional. The process of departure was marked by additional cruelties and humiliations. Some ship captains charged exorbitant fees for passage, while others deliberately stranded their Jewish passengers on sandbanks or remote shores. Pirates attacked Jewish refugees, knowing they carried their life savings in portable form. Many elderly or infirm Jews died during the journey, while others were robbed or murdered by their supposed protectors. The economic impact of the expulsion was immediately apparent. The The confiscated Jewish property provided Edward with a windfall of approximately £100,000, enough to fund military campaigns and satisfy immediate financial needs. But the long-term consequences were more problematic. England lost its only source of readily available credit just as the kingdom was embarking on expensive military adventures in Scotland and France. The social and cultural impact of the expulsion was equally significant. England became the first major European kingdom to be entirely free of Jewish settlement, creating a precedent that would be followed by other rulers and contributing to the development of a particularly virulent form of anti-Semitism that portrayed Jews as fundamentally alien to Christian society. The expulsion also had important political consequences. By eliminating the Jewish community, Edward removed a source of social tension that had been exploited by his enemies and critics. At the same time, he demonstrated his commitment to Christian orthodoxy in a way that enhanced his reputation among his subjects and his standing with the church. The theological justification for the expulsion drew on centuries of Christian anti-Semitic teaching. Jews were portrayed as enemies of Christ, who had rejected divine truth and therefore deserved punishment. Their expulsion was presented not as an act of ethnic hatred, but as a necessary step in the process of creating a truly Christian kingdom. This religious framework helped to legitimize what was essentially an act of state-sponsored theft and ethnic cleansing. By portraying the expulsion as divinely ordained, Edward's propagandists made it appear not just acceptable, but morally necessary. The fact that the expulsion was supported by Parliament and applauded by the church hierarchy gave it an appearance of legitimacy that made resistance impossible. The fate of England's expelled Jews varied considerably. Some managed to reach France or other continental destinations and rebuilt their lives in new communities. Others were less fortunate, dying in transit or arriving in places where they were unwelcome and unable to establish themselves. The psychological trauma of expulsion was compounded by the material losses and the destruction of communities that had existed for centuries. The expulsion of 1290 marked the end of medieval Jewish life in England, but it was not the end of Jewish influence on English culture and thought. Memory of the lost Jewish community persisted in literature, folklore, and popular culture, often in distorted and anti-Semitic forms that reinforced negative stereotypes. The absence of actual Jews made it easier for anti-Semitic myths to flourish unchallenged. Edward's expulsion of the Jews stands as one of the darkest chapters in his reign and one of the most shameful episodes in medieval English history. It revealed the terrible consequences of unchecked royal power, combined with religious prejudice and economic opportunism. The policy was successful in achieving its immediate objectives. It provided the crown with substantial revenue and eliminated a source of social tension. But it also established dangerous precedents for state-sponsored persecution and ethnic cleansing that would echo through the centuries. The long-term consequences of the expulsion extended far beyond England's borders. Other European rulers followed Edward's example, leading to a series of expulsions that eventually eliminated Jewish communities from much of Western Europe. The precedent of using royal authority to eliminate entire populations based on religious or ethnic identity would be invoked repeatedly throughout European history, contributing to centuries of persecution and violence. The Jewish community would not return to England until the mid-17th century, when Oliver Cromwell quietly allowed Jewish resettlement during the Commonwealth period. Even then, the return was unofficial and limited, and full Jewish civil rights would not be restored until the 19th century. The expulsion of 1290 thus represents not just a single act of persecution, but the beginning of a 350-year absence that impoverished English society and culture. In the Great Hall at Westminster, beneath soaring stone arches that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, a revolutionary experiment in governance was taking shape during the reign of Edward I. Here, in assemblies that would later be called Parliament, the foundations of representative government were being laid stone by stone, precedent by precedent, through the patient work of a king who understood that true authority came not from the arbitrary exercise of power, but from the willing cooperation of those who possessed the wealth and influence to make royal commands effective. The development of Parliament during Edward's reign was not the result of democratic idealism or abstract political theory. It emerged from practical necessity. The king's need to raise extraordinary revenues for his military campaigns, combined with his recognition that sustainable governance required the consent and cooperation of his subjects. What began as an expedient solution to immediate problems would eventually evolve into one of the most influential political institutions in world history. Edward inherited a tradition of royal consultation that stretched back to the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot and had been formalized by the Norman kings in their great councils. Henry III had occasionally summoned representatives from the towns and counties to these assemblies, particularly when he needed to justify new taxes or rally support for controversial policies. But these early parliaments had been irregular, informal, and largely ineffective. Edward's innovation was to transform Parliament from an occasional expedient into a regular and increasingly essential component of royal government. His approach revealed the same systematic thinking that characterized all his major reforms. He saw Parliament not as a limitation on royal authority, but as a mechanism for making that authority more effective and sustainable. The king's first significant parliament was summoned in 1275, shortly after his coronation. This assembly established patterns that would persist for centuries. Representatives from the counties, knights elected by their local communities, sat alongside burgesses chosen by the major towns. The great nobles and senior churchmen attended in their own right, creating a three-part assembly that represented the different orders of English society. The 1275 Parliament's primary business was taxation, but Edward used the occasion to build support for his broader reform program. The representatives were asked not just to approve new taxes, but to participate in discussions about legal reform, foreign policy, and administrative improvement. This approach transformed Parliament from a mechanism for extracting money into a forum for genuine political consultation. Edward's most famous parliament was the so-called Model Parliament of 1295, which has been remembered as the first truly representative assembly in English history. The summons to this parliament included not just the usual nobles and churchmen, but 2 knights from each county, 2 burgesses from each borough, and representatives of the lower clergy. The assembly thus included voices from virtually every significant social group in medieval England. The model parliament was summoned during a period of particular crisis, when Edward faced simultaneous wars in Wales, Scotland, and France. The king needed extraordinary financial support, but he also needed political backing for policies that would affect every part of English society. The Parliament's comprehensive representation reflected Edward's understanding that effective governance in such circumstances required the broadest possible base of support. The proceedings of the Model Parliament revealed Edward's sophisticated approach to political management. Rather than simply demanding money and obedience, the king presented detailed explanations of his policies and their justifications. He allowed representatives to raise concerns about local grievances and promised to address legitimate complaints. Most importantly, he treated Parliament as a partner in governance, rather than merely as a source of revenue. This collaborative approach was not motivated by democratic sentiment, but by practical politics. Edward understood that taxes approved by Parliament would be collected more efficiently than those imposed by royal decree. Laws endorsed by representative assemblies would be enforced more willingly by local communities. Military service authorized by Parliament would be more enthusiastic and reliable than that compelled by royal command alone. The development of parliamentary procedure during Edward's reign laid the groundwork for centuries of constitutional evolution. The practice of requiring parliamentary consent for new taxes became so firmly established that future kings would find it impossible to govern effectively without regular assemblies. The principle that Parliament had the right to present grievances and expect royal responses created a mechanism for peaceful political change that would prove crucial during periods of constitutional crisis. Edward's use of Parliament also revealed his understanding of the changing nature of English society. The traditional feudal relationships that had governed medieval England were being gradually supplemented by more complex economic and social connections. The growth of towns, the emergence of a substantial middle class, and the increasing importance of trade and commerce all created new centers of power that could not be effectively governed through feudal structures alone. By including representatives of these new social groups in Parliament, Edward was acknowledging their importance while ensuring their loyalty to the crown. The knights and burgesses who sat in his parliaments were generally successful, ambitious men who had substantial stakes in maintaining political stability and economic prosperity. Their participation in government gave them a sense of ownership in royal policy, while providing the crown with access to their local knowledge and influence. The evolution of parliamentary privilege during Edward's reign established important principles that would protect representative government during future conflicts with royal authority. Members of Parliament gradually acquired the right to speak freely during debates without fear of royal retaliation. They also developed immunities from arrest during parliamentary sessions and while travelling to and from Westminster. These privileges were not granted out of respect for democratic principles, but because Edward recognized that effective parliamentary consultation required that representatives be able to speak honestly about local conditions and grievances. A parliament whose members feared royal punishment for unwelcome opinions would be useless as a source of accurate information and genuine political support. The relationship between Parliament and the royal administration also evolved during Edward's reign. Parliamentary sessions provided opportunities for representatives to scrutinize royal officials and to demand explanations for administrative failures or abuses. This oversight function helped to improve the quality of royal government while giving local communities a voice in how they were governed. Edward's approach to parliamentary management revealed his exceptional political skills. He understood that different groups of representatives had different interests and concerns, and he tailored his appeals accordingly. The knights were interested primarily in military affairs and local administration. The burgesses cared most about trade policy and urban privileges. The clergy were concerned with ecclesiastical matters and moral issues. The king's ability to build coalitions among these diverse groups was crucial for his success in Parliament. He learned to present his policies in ways that addressed multiple concerns simultaneously, and he was willing to make specific concessions to individual groups when necessary to maintain overall support for his program. The financial innovations that accompanied the development of Parliament were equally significant. Edward's reign saw the emergence of increasingly sophisticated methods for assessing and collecting taxes, based on more accurate information about local resources and economic conditions. Parliamentary representatives played crucial roles in these processes, both by providing information about local tax capacity and by ensuring that tax collection was carried out fairly and efficiently. The principle of no taxation without representation was established in practice, if not in theory, during Edward's reign. While the king retained the legal right to impose certain traditional taxes without parliamentary consent, he found it increasingly difficult to raise significant revenues. without assembly approval. This practical limitation on royal financial independence would prove crucial for the development of constitutional government. Edward's use of Parliament to legitimize controversial policies was particularly evident in his treatment of the Jewish community and his wars of conquest. The expulsion of the Jews in 1290 was presented to Parliament as a measure supported by popular demand and justified by Christian piety. The wars in Wales and Scotland were portrayed as necessary responses to rebellion and threats to royal authority. By securing parliamentary endorsement for these policies, Edward protected himself against criticism while sharing responsibility for their consequences. Parliament's approval gave controversial royal actions an appearance of legitimacy that made resistance more difficult and provided the crown with valuable political cover when policies produced unexpected problems. The development of parliamentary records during Edward's reign created an institutional memory that would prove crucial for future constitutional development. The systematic recording of parliamentary proceedings, tax grants, and legislative decisions provided precedents that could be invoked during later conflicts between Crown and Parliament. These records also revealed the gradual evolution of parliamentary power and influence. Early parliaments were clearly subordinate to royal authority, with representatives playing primarily consultative roles. But over time, Parliament's control over taxation gave it increasing leverage over royal policy, and its role in legislation expanded from mere approval to active participation in the drafting process. The geographic representation that characterized Edward's parliaments helped to integrate England's diverse regions into a unified political system. Representatives from remote counties and small towns were brought into direct contact with royal government and with each other, creating networks of communication and cooperation that strengthened national unity. This integration was particularly important given the regional tensions that had characterized English politics during the baronial wars of Henry III's reign. By providing legitimate channels for local grievances and concerns, Parliament helped to prevent the kind of regional rebellions that had previously threatened royal authority. The long-term constitutional significance of Edward's parliamentary innovations cannot be overstated. The principles and procedures established during his reign provided the foundation for centuries of political development that would eventually produce modern representative democracy. The idea that government should be based on the consent of the governed, that taxation required representative approval, and that subjects had rights that even kings must respect all, had their roots in the parliamentary experiments of Edward I's reign. But perhaps the most important legacy of Edward's approach to Parliament was the demonstration that strong royal authority and representative government could coexist and reinforce each other. Rather than weakening royal power, Parliament actually strengthened Edward's position by providing him with the resources and legitimacy necessary for effective governance. This lesson would prove crucial for understanding how monarchical and representative institutions could work together to create stable, effective government. In the misty highlands of Scotland, where ancient clans had ruled their mountain fastnesses for centuries, and the stone circles of forgotten peoples stood sentinel over Loch, dark as polished obsidian, a storm was gathering that would reshape the destiny of both kingdoms. Edward I, having crushed Welsh independence beneath his iron-shod heel, and built his ring of stone castles to hold that conquered land, now turned his calculating gaze northward to Scotland, a realm that had long enjoyed peaceful relations with England, but whose very independence he had come to see as an intolerable affront to his vision of British unity under English rule. The origins of Edward's Scottish ambitions lay not in ancient grievances or territorial disputes, but in a succession crisis that created what the king saw as an unprecedented opportunity to extend English dominance over the entire British Isles. For over a century, relations between England and Scotland had been remarkably peaceful. The two kingdoms had developed a system of mutual respect and cooperation that allowed them to coexist as neighbours without the constant border warfare that characterised so many medieval frontiers. This peaceful equilibrium was shattered by a series of tragic deaths that left Scotland without a clear heir to the throne. King Alexander III of Scotland died in 1286 when his horse stumbled on a cliff path during a storm, leaving only his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, as his heir. The prospect of a child queen ruling Scotland was troubling enough, but when little Margaret died in 1290 during her voyage from Norway to claim her inheritance, Scotland found itself facing the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed kingdoms throughout medieval Europe. The death of the Maid of Norway left Scotland with no obvious heir and multiple claimants whose competing claims threatened to plunge the kingdom into civil war. The most serious contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, both of whom could trace their lineage back to earlier Scottish kings, but whose rival claims were based on different principles of inheritance that medieval law had never clearly resolved. Faced with this crisis, the Scottish nobles made what seemed, at the time, to be a reasonable decision. They invited Edward I to arbitrate the dispute and help them choose a new king. Edward was the most powerful monarch in Britain. He had experience in resolving complex legal disputes, and his intervention could provide the legitimacy that any chosen candidate would need to rule effectively. What the Scots failed to anticipate was that Edward would use their invitation as an opportunity to assert permanent English dominance over their kingdom. Edward's response to the Scottish invitation revealed the calculating intelligence that characterized all his major political decisions. He agreed to arbitrate the succession dispute, but only on condition that all claimants and the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as the overlord of Scotland with the right to make final decisions about the kingdom's future. This demand transformed what should have been a limited intervention into a fundamental challenge to Scottish independence. The Scots were trapped. They needed Edward's arbitration to prevent civil war, but accepting his conditions would compromise their independence. After months of negotiation and debate, the pressure of the deteriorating political situation forced them to accept Edward's terms. In 1291, the Scottish nobles and succession claimants formally acknowledged Edward I as the overlord of Scotland, giving him the legal authority he would later use to justify his conquest of the Northern Kingdom. Edward's decision to award the crown to John Balliol in 1292 was based on careful legal analysis of the competing claims, but it was also influenced by his assessment of which candidate would be most amenable to English control. Balliol had the stronger legal claim based on primogeniture, but he was also seen as weak and likely to be dependent on English support to maintain his authority. The coronation of John Balliol as King of Scots marked the beginning of what would become one of the most bitter and prolonged conflicts in medieval European history. Edward treated Balliol not as the independent ruler of a sovereign kingdom, but as a feudal vassal whose authority derived from English grant and who owed obedience to the English crown in all matters of importance. This relationship might have been sustainable if Edward had been content to exercise his overlordship in the traditional feudal manner, accepting homage, receiving occasional tribute, and intervening only in cases of serious dispute. But Edward's vision of British unity required much more active English control over Scottish affairs. He began hearing appeals from Scottish courts, summoning Balliol to appear before English tribunals, and demanding Scottish military service for English wars. The final provocation came in 1294, when Edward demanded that Scottish nobles provide military service for his war against France. This demand violated the fundamental principle that vassals could not be required to serve against their overlord's enemies unless their own territories were directly threatened. when the Scottish nobles refused to serve in France and instead negotiated their own alliance with the French king, Edward had the excuse he needed to begin the conquest of Scotland. Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296 demonstrated the same systematic planning and overwhelming force that had characterized his conquest of Wales. But Scotland presented very different challenges from those he had faced in Wales. The Scottish kingdom was larger, more populous, and better organized than Wales had been. Scottish nobles commanded substantial military resources, and the kingdom's geography provided numerous opportunities for defensive warfare that could neutralize English advantages in open battle. The English campaign began with the siege and sack of Berwick upon Tweed, Scotland's most important commercial centre and the symbol of Scottish prosperity. Edward's treatment of Berwick revealed the ruthless determination that would characterize his entire Scottish policy. The town was stormed and its population massacred, with contemporary chroniclers reporting that the slaughter continued for days until the very sight of blood-soaked streets moved even Edward's hardened soldiers to pity. The destruction of Berwick was intended to serve both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it eliminated Scotland's most important port and commercial centre, dealing a devastating blow to the kingdom's economy. Psychologically, it demonstrated that Edward would show no mercy to those who resisted his authority, and that the cost of continued defiance would be higher than any rational people could afford to pay. The Battle of Dunbar, fought on April 27, 1296, seemed to complete Edward's conquest of Scotland with remarkable speed and thoroughness. The Scottish army, commanded by John Comyn, the Red, and other leading nobles, was decisively defeated by English forces under the command of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey. The scale of the English victory was so overwhelming that organised Scottish resistance appeared to collapse entirely. King John Balliol, abandoned by his nobles and facing the prospect of continued warfare that could only bring destruction to his kingdom, formally abdicated in July 1296. In a ceremony designed to humiliate both the man and the office he had held, Balliol was stripped of his royal regalia and forced to confess his rebellion against his rightful overlord. The empty crown and sceptre were sent to Edward as symbols of Scotland's submission. Edward's actions following Balliol's abdication revealed his intention to eliminate Scottish independence permanently, rather than simply replacing one Scottish king with another. Instead of installing a new puppet ruler, he declared himself the direct ruler of Scotland and began implementing the same systematic policies of cultural suppression and administrative integration that had proved successful in Wales. The most symbolically important of Edward's actions was the removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey to Westminster Abbey. This ancient stone, upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was incorporated into a new coronation chair for English monarchs. The message was unmistakable. Scotland would have no more kings, and its ancient symbols of independence would serve henceforth to legitimize English rule. Edward's administrative reorganization of Scotland followed the same pattern he had employed in Wales. Scottish nobles were replaced by English officials, Scottish law was superseded by English common law, and Scottish revenues were redirected to support English policy. The kingdom was divided into administrative districts governed by English sheriffs who reported directly to Westminster rather than to any Scottish authority. The cultural assault on Scottish identity was equally systematic. Scottish records and chronicles were confiscated and removed to England, breaking the written connection between the Scottish people and their history. Scottish noble families were required to send their children to be educated in England, ensuring that future Scottish leaders would be raised in English customs and loyal to English interests. But Edward's triumph in Scotland proved to be far less complete than his victory in Wales had been. The Scottish kingdom was too large and too well established to be absorbed as easily as the Welsh principalities had been. More importantly, Edward's harsh treatment of the Scottish people created new sources of resentment and resistance that his administrative reforms could not address. The first signs of renewed Scottish resistance appeared within months of Edward's apparent victory. In the remote highlands and border regions where English control was weakest, small groups of Scottish nobles began organising resistance movements that used guerrilla tactics to harass English garrisons and supply lines. These early rebellions were limited in scope and easily suppressed, but they demonstrated that Scottish opposition to English rule remained alive despite the military catastrophe at Dunbar. The situation was further complicated by Edward's absence from Scotland for much of 1297, as he was forced to deal with rebellions in Wales and financial crises in England. The English administration he had established in Scotland was competent enough to maintain routine governance, but it lacked the authority and resources necessary to address emerging challenges or respond effectively to new forms of resistance. By the summer of 1297, Scottish resistance had found effective leadership in the persons of William Wallace, a minor noble from the southwest, and Andrew Moray, who organised resistance in the Northern Highlands. These men represented different regions and social backgrounds, but they shared a common commitment to driving the English out of Scotland and restoring Scottish independence. The emergence of Wallace and Moray as resistance leaders marked a fundamental change in the nature of Scottish opposition to English rule. Previous rebellions had been led by great nobles, whose primary concern was often their own position rather than Scottish independence. Wallace and Moray, however, appealed directly to the common people of Scotland and organised a truly national resistance movement that transcended regional and social divisions. The success of this new resistance movement was dramatically demonstrated at the Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, where a Scottish army commanded by Wallace and Moray decisively defeated a much larger English force. The victory was achieved through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of local terrain, but it also reflected the enthusiasm and determination of Scottish soldiers who were fighting for their homeland rather than merely following noble commands. The Battle of Stirling Bridge sent shockwaves throughout Britain and Europe. Edward's reputation for military invincibility was shattered, and the myth of inevitable English dominance over Scotland was exposed as false. More importantly, the victory demonstrated that the Scottish people possessed both the will and the ability to resist English conquest, transforming what had appeared to be a successful conquest into the beginning of a prolonged and bitter war. Edward's response to the disaster at Stirling Bridge revealed both his determination to complete the conquest of Scotland and his understanding of the changed nature of the conflict he now faced. This was no longer a matter of suppressing isolated rebellions or installing a compliant puppet ruler. The Scots had demonstrated their intention to fight for complete independence, and Edward would have to conquer them all over again if he hoped to achieve his vision of British unity under English rule. The King's return to Scotland in 1298 marked the beginning of a new phase in the Scottish Wars that would continue until his death nearly a decade later. Edward now understood that conquering Scotland would require not just military victory, but the systematic destruction of Scottish resistance through whatever means proved necessary. The methods he would employ in this renewed campaign would earn him the title Hammer of the Scots, while creating wounds in Anglo-Scottish relations that would endure for centuries. In the rolling hills of southern Scotland, where the ancient forests still whispered with the voices of Celtic warriors, and the morning mist clung to stone circles older than memory, a legend was being born that would outlive kingdoms and inspire generations yet unborn. William Wallace, a name that would echo through centuries of Scottish ballads and stir the hearts of patriots around the world, emerged from the ranks of Scotland's minor nobility to become the embodiment of his nation's refusal to accept foreign domination. Wallace's origins were humble by the standards of medieval politics. Born around 1270 into a family of small landowners in Renfrewshire, he possessed neither the vast estates nor the ancient lineage that typically elevated men to positions of leadership in feudal society. His father, Malcolm Wallace, held modest properties as a vassal of James Stuart, one of Scotland's great nobles, but the family's influence extended little beyond their immediate neighbourhood. What transformed this obscure younger son into one of history's most celebrated freedom fighters remains partially shrouded in the mists of legend and propaganda. Contemporary records tell us little about Wallace's early life, or the specific events that drove him to rebellion against English rule. Later chroniclers, writing decades or centuries after his death, wove romantic tales of personal tragedy and injustice that may or may not reflect historical reality. The most persistent legend claims that Wallace's father or brother was killed by English soldiers, or that his young wife was murdered by an English sheriff, providing the personal motivation for his rebellion. While these stories cannot be verified from contemporary sources, they reflect the very real experiences of countless Scottish families who suffered under the harsh realities of English occupation after Edward I's conquest in 1296. What is certain is that by 1297, Wallace had emerged as one of the most effective leaders of Scottish resistance to English rule. Unlike the great nobles who had initially submitted to Edward and then rebelled when the terms of submission proved unacceptable, Wallace seems to have opposed English domination from the beginning. He represented a new kind of Scottish leader, one whose authority came not from feudal rank or inherited position, but from his ability to articulate the grievances of ordinary Scots and organize them into effective resistance. Wallace's early military activities followed the pattern of guerrilla warfare that was becoming characteristic of Scottish resistance. Small bands of armed men would strike at English garrisons, supply convoys, and administrative centres before melting back into the countryside, where local support made pursuit difficult and dangerous. These tactics were well suited to Scotland's geography and to the limitations of the English occupation force, which was too small to maintain effective control over the entire kingdom. The significance of Wallace's leadership became apparent in the spring and summer of 1297, when isolated acts of resistance began to coalesce into a coordinated national rebellion. Wallace's ability to unite different regions and social groups behind a common cause was remarkable. He forged alliances between Highland clans and lowland farmers, between minor nobles and urban craftsmen, between secular and ecclesiastical authorities, who had previously been divided by regional rivalries and conflicting interests. The rebellion that erupted across Scotland in 1297 was different in character from the noble-led revolts that had characterized previous Scottish resistance to English rule. This was a popular uprising that drew its strength from the resentment and determination of ordinary people who had experienced English occupation firsthand. The harsh taxation, arbitrary justice, and cultural suppression that characterized English rule in Scotland had created grievances that transcended traditional social divisions. Wallace's genius lay not just in his ability to organize this popular resistance, but in his understanding of how to transform guerrilla warfare into something approaching conventional military action. By September 1297, he had succeeded in assembling a substantial army that could challenge English forces in open battle, rather than merely harassing them from the shadows. The convergence of Wallace's forces with those of Andrew Moray, who had been organizing resistance in the Northern Highlands, created a combined Scottish army that represented the most serious threat to English rule since Edward's conquest. Moray brought to the alliance crucial military experience and connections with the Scottish nobility, while Wallace contributed his popular following and his reputation for incorruptible dedication to the cause of independence. The Battle of Stirling Bridge, fought on September 11, 1297, marked the climax of this phase of Scottish resistance and established Wallace's reputation as one of the great military leaders of his age. The battle was fought at a carefully chosen position where the River Forth created a natural bottleneck that neutralized English advantages in heavy cavalry and allowed superior Scottish knowledge of local terrain to determine the outcome. The English army, commanded by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland, was larger and better equipped than the Scottish force, but English overconfidence and poor tactical decisions allowed Wallace and Moray to spring a devastating trap. The English were allowed to begin crossing the narrow bridge over the Forth, but when about half their force had reached the Scottish side of the river, the Scots attacked with perfectly coordinated timing. The confined space prevented the English from using their superior numbers effectively, while the presence of the river made retreat impossible for those who had already crossed. The battle quickly became a massacre, with the Earl of Surrey's army destroyed, and many of its leaders, including Cressingham himself, killed in the fighting. The treasurer's body was reportedly flayed by the victorious Scots, with pieces of his skin distributed as grisly trophies of their triumph. The victory at Stirling Bridge had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The destruction of a major English army demonstrated that Edward's conquest of Scotland was far from complete, and that Scottish resistance possessed both the leadership and the military capability necessary to challenge English rule effectively. The psychological impact was equally important, as the victory proved to ordinary Scots that their English oppressors were not invincible, and that determined resistance could achieve remarkable results. Wallace's elevation to the position of Guardian of Scotland following the victory at Stirling Bridge reflected his emergence as the undisputed leader of Scottish resistance. This ancient title carried with it responsibility for governing Scotland in the absence of a king, and Wallace's assumption of the guardianship represented a remarkable rise for a man of such modest origins. It also demonstrated the extent to which traditional social hierarchies had been disrupted by the crisis of English occupation and the demands of national resistance. As Guardian, Wallace faced the enormous challenge of transforming military victory into sustainable political achievement. The Scottish kingdom needed to be reorganized, its administration restored, and its international position strengthened if independence was to be maintained against the inevitable English counterattack. Wallace approached these challenges with the same determination and practical intelligence that had characterized his military leadership. Wallace's diplomatic efforts revealed his sophisticated understanding of European politics and his recognition that Scottish independence could not be maintained through military means alone. He dispatched envoys to France, seeking to renew the traditional alliance between Scotland and France that had been broken by Edward's conquest. He also appealed to Pope Boniface VIII, arguing that Scotland was an ancient kingdom with legitimate claims to independence that should be recognized by the international community. These diplomatic initiatives achieved limited success, but they demonstrated Wallace's understanding that the Scottish struggle was part of a larger European conflict between different concepts of royal authority and national sovereignty. France was already at war with England, and French support for Scottish independence was a natural extension of this broader conflict. Papal recognition of Scottish claims would provide the kind of international legitimacy that could make it difficult for Edward to present his conquest as a legitimate assertion of feudal overlordship. The restoration of Scottish administration under Wallace's guardianship was complicated by the destruction and disruption that had accompanied the English conquest and the subsequent rebellion. Many Scottish nobles had fled the kingdom or submitted to English rule, leaving gaps in the traditional structure of governance that had to be filled by new men or improvised arrangements. Wallace's own modest social origins limited his ability to command automatic obedience from Scotland's traditional ruling class, forcing him to rely on personal charisma and demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority. Despite these challenges, Wallace succeeded in creating a functioning Scottish government that maintained order throughout much of the kingdom and successfully organized resistance to English attempts at reconquest. His administration collected taxes, dispensed justice, and coordinated military activities across Scotland's diverse regions. The fact that this government functioned effectively despite operating under wartime conditions and without many of the traditional sources of feudal authority was a testament to Wallace's administrative abilities and to the depth of popular support for the independence cause. Edward I's response to the disaster at Stirling Bridge and Wallace's subsequent achievements as Guardian was characteristically systematic and ruthless. The English king recognized that Wallace represented a qualitatively different kind of threat from previous Scottish resistance leaders. This was not a disgruntled noble who could be bought off with land grants or honours, but a popular leader whose authority was based on his commitment to complete independence rather than personal advancement. The campaign that Edward launched in 1298 to reconquer Scotland was larger and better planned than his previous efforts. He assembled an army of approximately 25,000 men, including substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen, whose effectiveness had been proven in the conquest of Wales. The king also took personal command of the expedition, recognizing that the defeat of Wallace would require his own presence and authority. The Battle of Falkirk, fought on July 22nd, 1298, marked the end of Wallace's period of military success and demonstrated both his tactical limitations and Edward's ability to adapt his methods to meet new challenges. Wallace had learned from the victory at Stirling Bridge that Scottish forces could defeat English armies when they could choose the terrain and timing of battle. But Edward was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had led to the disaster at Stirling Bridge. The battle was fought on open ground that favoured English heavy cavalry and longbowmen, neutralising the tactical advantages that had served the Scots so well in their previous victory. Wallace arranged his army in defensive formations called schiltrons, tight circles of spearmen, whose long weapons could hold off cavalry charges. This formation had proved effective in previous battles, but it was vulnerable to concentrated archery fire. Edward's tactical plan at Falkirk demonstrated his military genius and his willingness to learn from previous defeats, rather than attempting the kind of direct cavalry assault that had failed at Stirling Bridge. He used his Welsh longbowmen to break up the Scottish spear formations before committing his heavy cavalry to the attack. The result was a devastating English victory that destroyed Wallace's army and ended his effectiveness as a military leader. The defeat at Falkirk forced Wallace to abandon his position as Guardian of Scotland and retreat into a kind of guerrilla existence that would continue until his capture 7 years later. But his removal from formal leadership did not end Scottish resistance to English rule. Other leaders emerged to take his place, most notably Robert the Bruce, who would eventually achieve the complete independence that Wallace had fought for but never lived to see. Wallace's later years were spent as a fugitive, moving between Scotland and the continent in a desperate attempt to maintain international support for Scottish independence while evading English efforts to capture him. His diplomatic missions to France and Rome achieved limited success, but they demonstrated his continued commitment to the cause even when military victory seemed impossible. The betrayal and capture of Wallace in 1305 marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in medieval history. According to contemporary accounts, he was betrayed by Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had submitted to English rule, and handed over to English authorities near Glasgow. The circumstances of his capture remain controversial, but there is no doubt that Edward I regarded his prisoner as the most dangerous enemy the English crown had faced in Scotland. Wallace's trial and execution in London were designed to serve both as revenge for his military successes and as a warning to other potential rebels. The charges against him included treason, murder, and sacrilege, but the real crime in Edward's eyes was his refusal to acknowledge English authority over Scotland. The brutal method of execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was reserved for traitors, and was intended to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who challenged royal authority. The impact of Wallace's death on Scottish morale was the opposite of what Edward had intended. Rather than ending Scottish resistance, his execution transformed him into a martyr whose memory would inspire future generations of Scottish patriots. The brutality of his treatment aroused sympathy even among some English observers, while his refusal to seek mercy by acknowledging Edward's authority reinforced his reputation for incorruptible dedication to Scottish independence. Wallace's legacy extended far beyond his immediate impact on the Scottish Wars of Independence. His example demonstrated that effective resistance to foreign domination could be organized by leaders who drew their authority from popular support, rather than inherited position. His success in uniting different regions and social groups behind a common cause provided a model for national liberation movements throughout subsequent history. Perhaps most importantly, Wallace's career illustrated the power of ideas and principles to sustain resistance even in the face of overwhelming military disadvantage. His refusal to compromise his commitment to Scottish independence, even when such compromise might have preserved his life and position, established a standard of patriotic virtue that would inspire not just Scots, but freedom fighters around the world. The story of William Wallace thus transcends the immediate context of medieval Anglo-Scottish conflict to become part of the larger human story of resistance to oppression and the struggle for self-determination. His transformation from obscure country gentleman to national hero and international symbol demonstrates the capacity of individuals to change the course of history through courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to principle. As the 14th century dawned over a Britain scarred by decades of warfare, Edward I found himself an aging king ruling over a realm that seemed perpetually poised on the brink of crisis. The man who had once strode across battlefields like a conquering giant, his 6-foot frame casting long shadows over prostrate enemies, now moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body bore the accumulated weight of 68 hard-fought years. Yet his mind remained as sharp as ever, his will as inflexible as the steel of his sword, and his determination to complete the conquest of Scotland as fierce as the day he had first turned his calculating gaze northward. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 had been intended to mark the final chapter in Scotland's resistance to English rule. Edward had believed, with what would prove to be catastrophic overconfidence, that removing the symbol of Scottish defiance would crush the spirit of rebellion that had proven so difficult to extinguish. The barbaric spectacle in London, the hanging, drawing, and quartering of a man who had refused to acknowledge English authority even with the noose around his neck, was designed to send an unmistakable message to any who might consider following Wallace's example. But Scotland in 1306 was like a coal seam burning deep underground, its fires hidden from view, but ready to burst into devastating flame at the slightest disturbance. The apparent calm that had settled over the Northern Kingdom following Wallace's death was deceptive. Beneath the surface of English administrative control, resentment burned in the hearts of nobles who had been dispossessed, clergy who had seen their churches desecrated, and common people who had experienced the casual brutality of foreign occupation. The spark that ignited this smouldering discontent came from an unexpected quarter. Robert the Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the Scottish throne, and a man who had spent years collaborating with English rule, made a decision that would transform not just his own life, but the entire trajectory of Scottish history. On February 10th, 1306, in the church of the Greyfriars in Dumfries, Bruce met with John Comyn, his main rival for the Scottish throne, and a man whose family had been among the most consistent supporters of Scottish independence. What transpired in that church remains one of history's most controversial moments. Contemporary accounts agree that Bruce killed Comyn, but the circumstances remain disputed. Some chroniclers suggest that the killing was premeditated murder, part of Bruce's plan to eliminate his rival and claim the throne for himself. Others portray it as the result of a sudden quarrel that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. What is certain is that the killing of Comyn before the altar of a church was seen as both political rebellion and religious sacrilege. Bruce's response to this crisis revealed the calculating courage that would make him one of Scotland's greatest kings. Rather than fleeing or attempting to negotiate his way out of the predicament, he chose to embrace the full implications of his actions. Within 6 weeks of killing Comyn, Bruce had himself crowned King of Scotland at Scone Abbey, deliberately invoking the ancient traditions of Scottish kingship and throwing down a challenge to Edward I that could only be answered with war. The coronation of Robert the Bruce marked the beginning of a new phase in the Scottish Wars of Independence that would prove far more dangerous to English interests than anything that had come before. Unlike Wallace, who had emerged from the ranks of minor nobility with no legitimate claim to royal authority, Bruce was a member of one of Scotland's most powerful families with a clear hereditary right to the throne. His rebellion thus represented not just another uprising against foreign rule, but the revival of legitimate Scottish monarchy and the restoration of the kingdom's ancient independence. Edward's response to Bruce's coronation revealed both his strategic understanding of the threat and his growing desperation to complete the subjugation of Scotland before old age made active campaigning impossible. At nearly 70 years old, the king, who had once seemed invincible in battle, was increasingly dependent on younger commanders and professional soldiers to carry out his military objectives. Yet his political acumen remained undimmed, and he recognized immediately that Bruce's rebellion posed challenges that none of his previous Scottish enemies had presented. The campaign that Edward launched against Bruce in 1306 was characterized by a systematic brutality that exceeded even his harsh treatment of Wales. This was no longer merely a matter of suppressing rebellion. It had become a struggle for the very survival of Scottish national identity. Edward's forces were instructed to show no mercy to captured rebels, and the king himself issued orders that any who supported Bruce should be treated as traitors deserving the most extreme punishment. The early months of Bruce's kingship seemed to justify Edward's confidence that this latest rebellion could be crushed as decisively as previous Scottish resistance. Bruce's forces were scattered by English armies at the battles of Methven and Dalry, and the new king was forced to flee into hiding in the remote highlands and islands of western Scotland. Many of his supporters were captured and executed, while others abandoned his cause and submitted to English authority. But Bruce possessed qualities that his predecessors had lacked, not just the legitimacy that came from royal blood, but the practical intelligence to learn from their mistakes and the patience to wage a prolonged campaign that played to Scottish strengths rather than English advantages. During his months as a fugitive, Bruce developed the guerrilla tactics that would eventually drive the English from Scotland and established the network of supporters who would form the core of his eventual triumph. The legend of Bruce's encounter with a spider in a cave, watching it persistently rebuild its web despite repeated failures, may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captures the patient determination that characterized his approach to the seemingly impossible task of driving the English from Scotland. Unlike Wallace, who had sought to defeat English armies in conventional battles, Bruce understood that Scottish independence could only be achieved through a campaign of attrition that gradually wore down English resources and resolve. Edward's health was deteriorating rapidly during this period, though he fought to conceal his weakness from both enemies and supporters. The king, who had once led charges personally, was increasingly confined to travelling in a litter, his body racked by dysentery and other ailments that made extended campaigning impossible. Yet his mental faculties remained sharp, and his understanding of the strategic situation was as clear as ever. The aging king's determination to complete the conquest of Scotland before his death led to increasingly desperate measures. He ordered the systematic destruction of Scottish castles that could not be adequately garrisoned, the deportation of Scottish nobles to English prisons, and the confiscation of church property that might support rebellion. These harsh policies succeeded in maintaining English control over much of Scotland, but they also created new grievances that strengthened support for Bruce's cause. Edward's relationship with his son and heir, the future Edward II, became increasingly strained during this period, as the king's frustration with Scottish resistance combined with his growing doubts about his successor's capabilities. The prince was brave enough in battle, but he lacked his father's political intelligence and his understanding of the systematic approach required to complete the conquest of Scotland. Edward's attempts to prepare his son for the responsibilities of kingship were complicated by the prince's relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose influence over the heir apparent Edward I viewed with deep suspicion and growing alarm. The king's efforts to remove Gaveston from his son's court and to prepare the prince for independent command revealed the depth of his concerns about the future of English policy in Scotland. Edward understood that the conquest of Scotland required not just military success, but the kind of sustained political commitment that could only come from a king who fully understood the stakes involved. His son's apparent infatuation with court favourites and his lack of interest in the detailed work of governance suggested that the achievements of Edward I's reign might not survive his death. The winter of 1306 to 1307 marked a turning point in both the Scottish conflict and Edward's personal struggle with declining health. Bruce had begun the process of rebuilding Scottish resistance, establishing secure bases in the southwest, and launching increasingly bold attacks on English positions. Meanwhile, Edward's physical condition had deteriorated to the point where even his closest advisors recognized that he might not survive another major campaign. The king's response to these twin challenges revealed the indomitable will that had driven him throughout his life. Despite his physician's warnings and the obvious risks to his health, Edward insisted on personally leading one final campaign designed to crush Bruce's rebellion permanently. This decision reflected not just his understanding of the military situation, but his awareness that only his personal presence could provide the kind of leadership necessary to complete the conquest of Scotland. The preparations for Edward's final Scottish campaign were characterized by the same attention to detail that had marked all his military enterprises. Despite his physical limitations, the king insisted on reviewing every aspect of the planning, from the recruitment of soldiers to the organization of supply lines. He understood that this would likely be his last opportunity to achieve the goal that had consumed so much of his energy during the final decade of his reign. The army that assembled for Edward's final campaign was substantial by medieval standards, including significant numbers of Welsh longbowmen, English knights, and foreign mercenaries. But the force also revealed the financial strains that decades of warfare had placed on the English crown. Many of the soldiers were serving for pay rather than feudal obligation, and the cost of maintaining such a large professional army was placing increasing pressure on England's resources. Edward's advance towards Scotland in the spring of 1307 was slow and painful, as his deteriorating health made rapid movement impossible. The king travelled in a litter for much of the journey, rising only occasionally to show himself to his troops and maintain the illusion that he remained capable of active leadership. His determination to continue despite obvious physical suffering impressed even his enemies and reinforced his reputation as a ruler who would let nothing prevent him from achieving his objectives. The end came on July the 7th, 1307, at Berg by Sands, just south of the Scottish border, within sight of the kingdom that had consumed so much of Edward's later years. According to contemporary accounts, the king died while being helped to eat breakfast, his body finally succumbing to the illnesses that he had fought off through sheer force of will for months. His last recorded words were reportedly instructions to his son to carry his bones with the army until Scotland was completely conquered, a final testament to his uncompromising commitment to the goal that had eluded him despite decades of effort. Edward's death marked the end of an era in English history and the beginning of a new phase in the Scottish Wars of Independence that would ultimately see Bruce achieve the complete victory that had eluded Wallace. The new king, Edward II, lacked both his father's military genius and his political understanding of what was required to complete the conquest of Scotland. Within 7 years, Bruce would win the decisive victory at Bannockburn that would secure Scottish independence and render Edward III's Scottish ambitions permanently unfulfilled. The final years of Edward I's reign thus present the spectacle of a great king gradually overwhelmed by the limitations of medieval power and the stubborn resistance of a people determined to maintain their independence. His failure to complete the conquest of Scotland stands as perhaps the greatest disappointment of a career marked by remarkable achievements in law, administration, and military conquest. Yet even in failure, Edward's Scottish campaigns revealed the qualities that had made him one of England's greatest kings: his strategic vision, his administrative genius, and his absolute determination to achieve his objectives regardless of the personal cost. The morning of July 7th, 1307, dawned grey and misty over the marshlands of Berg by Sands, a remote hamlet near the Scottish border where the Irish Sea met the ancient stones of Hadrian's Wall. In a modest dwelling that served as the English king's temporary residence, servants moved quietly about their duties, preparing breakfast for a man who had once commanded the fate of nations but now struggled to lift a spoon to his lips. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, the conqueror of Wales, the Lawgiver who had shaped England's future, was dying. The king's final campaign had ground to a halt just miles from the Scottish border, his magnificent army waiting in vain for orders from a commander whose iron will could no longer animate a body ravaged by dysentery and the accumulated toll of 68 years of relentless activity. For months, Edward had refused to acknowledge the obvious reality of his declining health, driving himself forward through sheer determination toward what he knew would be his final attempt to complete the conquest of Scotland. Those who witnessed Edward's last hours reported that he retained his mental faculties until the very end, continuing to issue instructions for the campaign and expressing his unwavering determination to see Robert the Bruce defeated and Scotland brought permanently under English rule. When his servants came to help him eat breakfast, a simple meal of bread and ale that represented a pathetic contrast to the magnificent feasts he had once hosted in the great halls of Westminster, the king attempted to rise from his bed to demonstrate that he was still capable of leading his army. But the gesture was futile. Edward's strength failed him, and he collapsed back onto his pillow, his breathing becoming labored as his attendants gathered around the bed. In those final moments, according to the chroniclers who recorded the scene, the dying king's thoughts turned not to the comfort of religious absolution, or the prospect of a heavenly rest, but to the unfinished business that had consumed the final years of his reign. The legends that grew up around Edward's deathbed speak of his final words as a command to his son and heir: "Carry my bones before you on your march to Scotland, for the rebels will not be able to look upon me, dead though I may be, without trembling." Whether these words were actually spoken or were invented by later chroniclers to capture the essence of Edward's character, they perfectly embodied the relentless determination that had defined his approach to kingship throughout his life. As word of the king's death spread through the camp, a strange quiet settled over the thousands of soldiers who had followed Edward on what they now realized had been his final campaign. Many of these men had served under him for decades, had witnessed his triumphs in Wales and his frustrations in Scotland, had seen him transform from the vigorous warrior king of his early reign into the aging but still formidable ruler whose very presence could inspire loyalty and strike fear into his enemies. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the system of personal monarchy that had characterized medieval England. The king's death automatically transferred his authority to his son, but it also created a dangerous period of uncertainty during which the continuity of royal policy depended entirely on the character and capabilities of the new monarch. In this case, those capabilities would prove tragically inadequate to the challenges that lay ahead. Edward II, who now found himself King of England at the age of 23, possessed many admirable qualities. He was brave in battle, physically strong, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects, but he lacked the political intelligence, the systematic approach to governance, and the implacable determination that had made his father one of England's greatest kings. Perhaps most fatally, he failed to understand that kingship in the early 14th century required constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to the assertion of royal authority. The new king's first decision regarding his father's body revealed both his filial respect and his fundamental misunderstanding of the symbolic importance of royal actions. Rather than following Edward I's alleged instructions to carry his bones into Scotland, Edward II ordered that his father be given a proper royal burial at Westminster Abbey. The decision was understandable from a human perspective, but it represented a public acknowledgement that the Scottish campaign would be abandoned, a signal of weakness that Robert the Bruce was quick to exploit. The funeral of Edward I at Westminster Abbey in October 1307 provided an opportunity for reflection on the extraordinary achievements and complex legacy of one of England's most remarkable kings. The tomb that was constructed for him was notably simple by royal standards, a plain sarcophagus of dark Purbeck marble, without the elaborate effigy that adorned most royal monuments. Whether this simplicity reflected the depleted state of the royal treasury, or a deliberate choice to emphasize Edward's reputation as a practical, no-nonsense ruler, the modest tomb seemed appropriate for a king whose greatest monuments were not built of stone, but carved from the living institutions of English government. The inscription later added to Edward's tomb, Edwardus primus Scotorum malleus hic est, here lies Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, captured both his military reputation and the central obsession of his later years. The title Hammer of the Scots was not contemporary to Edward's lifetime, but was added centuries later, reflecting how subsequent generations chose to remember him. Yet it was fitting, for Edward's Scottish campaigns, however ultimately unsuccessful, had revealed the full extent of his strategic vision and his willingness to pursue his objectives regardless of the cost. The immediate consequences of Edward's death were felt most dramatically in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce quickly moved to exploit the opportunity created by the transition to a weaker English king. Within months of Edward I's death, Bruce had launched a series of campaigns that would gradually drive English forces from Scotland and culminate in the decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314. The dream of British unity under English rule that had motivated Edward's Scottish wars would remain unfulfilled, and Scotland would maintain its independence for another 4 centuries. But Edward's legacy extended far beyond his military campaigns, however famous or infamous they might have been. His transformation of England's legal system created the foundation of English common law that would eventually influence legal development throughout the English-speaking world. The principles of legal uniformity, royal supremacy in matters of governance, and professional administration that Edward established would prove far more durable than any territorial conquest. Perhaps even more significantly, Edward's development of Parliament as a regular institution of government created the framework for England's eventual evolution toward constitutional monarchy. While Edward himself used Parliament primarily as a mechanism for raising taxes and building support for royal policy, the precedents he established for representative government would eventually limit royal power and create the foundation for democratic governance. The administrative innovations of Edward's reign were equally important for England's long-term development. The expansion of royal bureaucracy, the systematization of record-keeping, and the creation of professional civil service transformed medieval government from a collection of personal relationships into something resembling a modern state. These changes made it possible for royal authority to be exercised consistently throughout the realm, while providing the institutional continuity necessary for implementing complex policies across multiple reigns. Edward's approach to castle building and urban planning also left a lasting mark on the British landscape. The magnificent fortresses he constructed in Wales, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris, remain among the finest examples of medieval military architecture in Europe. More importantly, they demonstrated how royal power could be projected through architectural symbols that combined practical defensive capabilities with impressive displays of authority and permanence. The economic policies that Edward implemented, particularly his reforms of taxation and trade regulation, helped to create the foundation for England's later commercial expansion. His recognition that royal authority depended on the prosperity of his subjects led to policies that encouraged trade, protected merchants, and standardized commercial practices. These innovations contributed to the growth of English commerce that would eventually make the kingdom one of Europe's leading economic powers. Yet Edward's legacy was not without its dark shadows. His expulsion of England's Jewish population in 1290 established a precedent for state-sponsored persecution that would influence European politics for centuries. The systematic brutality he employed in Wales and Scotland created wounds in British relations that would never fully heal. His assertion of royal supremacy over traditional local autonomies helped to create the kind of centralized government that could achieve remarkable things, but could also oppress those who lacked the power to resist. The contradictions in Edward's character and policies reflected the broader tensions of his age, an era when medieval feudalism was giving way to more modern forms of governance, when local identities were being challenged by emerging national consciousness, and when traditional relationships between rulers and subjects were being redefined by changing economic and social conditions. Edward's genius lay in his ability to navigate these transitions while strengthening royal authority and building institutions that could survive the challenges of future centuries. The assessment of Edward I by subsequent generations has varied considerably, reflecting changing values and political circumstances. Medieval chroniclers generally praised him as a strong king, who restored order after the chaos of his father's reign, and who successfully defended English interests against foreign enemies. Renaissance historians emphasized his contributions to law and administration, seeing him as a founder of modern government who helped to create the institutional framework that made England a major European power. Modern historians have been more critical of Edward's methods while acknowledging his achievements. The nationalist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries led to increased sympathy for his Welsh and Scottish victims, while the Holocaust and other examples of ethnic cleansing have made his expulsion of the Jews appear particularly reprehensible. Yet scholars continue to recognize his importance as a transformative figure who helped to create the English state and who established principles of governance that influence political development far beyond his own kingdom. Perhaps the most balanced assessment of Edward I recognizes him as a man of his time who possessed both the virtues and the vices of medieval kingship in extreme measure. His intelligence, determination, and administrative genius enabled him to achieve remarkable things for England and to create institutions that served the kingdom well for centuries. But his ruthlessness, his ethnic prejudices, and his inability to accept limits on his authority also led to terrible injustices that stained his reputation and created lasting resentments. The England that Edward left to his son in 1307 was dramatically different from the kingdom he had inherited in 1272. It was more unified, more efficiently governed, and more militarily powerful than it had ever been before. The legal system was more rational and consistent. The administrative machinery was more professional and effective, and the financial resources of the crown were more systematically organized. Parliament had become a regular institution that provided both a mechanism for royal consultation and a forum for addressing grievances. But this transformed England also faced new challenges that would test the durability of Edward's innovations. The costs of his military campaigns had strained the kingdom's resources and created tensions between the crown and the nobility that would plague his successors. His failure to complete the conquest of Scotland left England with a dangerous enemy on its northern border, and a legacy of bitter conflict that would continue for generations. Most importantly, his son lacked the political skills necessary to maintain the delicate balance between royal authority and noble cooperation that Edward had achieved. The death of Edward I thus marked not just the end of a remarkable reign, but the beginning of a new era in English history that would test whether the institutions he had created could survive under less capable leadership. The answer would prove to be mixed. Some of his innovations would prove remarkably durable, while others would require modification or replacement as circumstances changed. But the fundamental transformation of English government that he had achieved would endure, providing the foundation for England's emergence as a major European power, and eventually as the centre of a global empire. In the quiet chambers of Westminster Abbey, where Edward I's simple tomb lies surrounded by the elaborate monuments of later kings, visitors often pause to contemplate the legacy of a monarch whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of medieval England. The man who had been laid to rest with such ceremony in 1307 had set in motion changes that would ripple through centuries, shaping not just the British Isles, but eventually touching every corner of the globe where English law, English institutions, and English concepts of governance would take root. The most immediate and visible legacy of Edward's reign could be seen in the transformed landscape of Britain itself. The great castles that rose from Welsh valleys and Scottish highlands stood as permanent reminders of English power, their massive walls and soaring towers proclaiming a message of dominance that would endure long after the armies that built them had crumbled to dust. Caernarfon Castle, with its distinctive polygonal towers modelled on the walls of Constantinople, became not just a fortress, but a symbol of imperial ambition that future English kings would invoke as they built their own empires across distant seas. But Edward's most profound and lasting influence lay not in stone and mortar, but in the invisible architecture of law and government that he had constructed throughout his reign. The system of common law that emerged from his legal reforms would prove to be one of history's most successful and enduring innovations in jurisprudence. Unlike the local customs and feudal privileges that had previously governed medieval England, common law was designed to be uniform, rational, and adaptable to changing circumstances. This legal revolution had consequences that Edward himself could never have imagined. When English settlers later established colonies in North America, Australia, and other distant lands, they carried with them the legal traditions that Edward had established. The principles of due process, trial by jury, and protection of property rights that were codified in his great statutes became the foundation of legal systems that would eventually govern hundreds of millions of people around the world. The concept of parliamentary government that Edward developed as a practical tool for taxation and consultation would prove even more influential in the long term. The model parliament of 1295, with its inclusion of representatives from counties, boroughs, and various estates of the realm, established precedents for representative government that would eventually evolve into modern democracy. The principle that taxation required representative consent, a practical necessity in Edward's time, would become a rallying cry for revolutionaries in America and reformers throughout the English-speaking world. Edward's administrative innovations also had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond medieval England. The professional civil service that he created, with its emphasis on competence over noble birth and its systematic approach to record-keeping and policy implementation, provided a model for efficient government that would be copied and adapted by rulers throughout Europe and beyond. The idea that government should be conducted according to rational principles rather than personal whim or ancient custom was revolutionary in the medieval context and remains fundamental to modern statecraft. The financial systems that Edward developed to fund his ambitious projects also established patterns that would influence government finance for centuries. His systematic approach to taxation, his careful accounting procedures, and his understanding of the relationship between economic prosperity and governmental effectiveness created models that later rulers would build upon as they faced the growing costs of modern warfare and administration. Perhaps most significantly, Edward's reign demonstrated how strong central government could coexist with representative institutions and legal protections for individual rights. This balance between authority and liberty would become one of the defining characteristics of the English political tradition and would prove crucial for England's later development into a constitutional monarchy that combined effective governance with protection for civil liberties. The cultural impact of Edward's reign was equally profound, though often overlooked in assessments focused on his political and military achievements. His patronage of literature, architecture, and scholarship helped to create a distinctive English cultural identity that would influence artistic and intellectual development for centuries. The Gothic cathedrals and castles built during his reign established architectural styles that would be copied throughout the English-speaking world, while the legal and administrative documents produced by his bureaucracy helped to standardize written English and contribute to the development of a national literature. Edward's approach to governance also established important precedents for the relationship between central authority and local autonomy that would prove crucial for the later development of federal systems of government. His recognition that effective rule required cooperation from local elites and accommodation of regional differences provided a model for governing diverse populations that would be adapted by later English administrators as they managed increasingly complex and far-flung territories. The military innovations that Edward pioneered during his campaigns in Wales and Scotland also had lasting influence on the development of warfare and military organization. His systematic approach to logistics, his integration of different types of troops into coordinated tactical formations, and his understanding of the relationship between military power and political objectives established patterns that would influence military thinking for centuries. The use of the English longbow, which proved so decisive in Edward's later campaigns, would become a defining characteristic of English military power for the next 2 centuries. The victories won by English archers at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt during the 100 Years' War were all built on tactical innovations and training methods that had their origins in Edward's Welsh and Scottish campaigns. More broadly, Edward's approach to warfare, with its emphasis on professional soldiers, systematic planning, and the integration of military action with political objectives, anticipated many of the characteristics of modern military organization. His understanding that lasting conquest required not just military victory, but administrative control and cultural transformation, provided a model for empire building that would be employed by European powers throughout the colonial period. The darker aspects of Edward's legacy also had lasting consequences that extended far beyond his own reign. His expulsion of England's Jewish population established a precedent for state-sponsored persecution that would be invoked by later rulers facing financial pressures or seeking to unite their subjects against a common enemy. The methods he employed in Wales and Scotland, the systematic destruction of local institutions, the implantation of foreign settlers, and the suppression of native culture, became a template for colonial conquest that would be applied around the world, with devastating consequences for indigenous populations. The concept of ethnic cleansing that Edward pioneered in his treatment of the Jews would reappear throughout European history, reaching its ultimate expression in the genocides of the 20th century. While Edward's actions were motivated by immediate political and financial considerations, rather than racial ideology, they demonstrated how state power could be used to eliminate entire populations and established precedents that would be invoked by later practitioners of ethnic persecution. Similarly, Edward's methods of conquest and cultural suppression in Wales and Scotland provided models for European colonization that would be employed throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The combination of military conquest, administrative control, and cultural transformation that he perfected in his British campaigns became the standard approach to imperial expansion that would shape the modern world. Yet the most remarkable aspect of Edward's legacy may be its sheer durability and adaptability. The institutions he created were strong enough to survive the weak kingship of his son, the chaos of the 100 Years' War, the upheavals of the Reformation, and the revolutionary changes of the modern era. The legal principles he established continued to evolve and develop, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The parliamentary traditions that emerged from his reign provided the framework for England's peaceful evolution from medieval monarchy to modern democracy. The administrative systems he created formed the foundation for the civil service that would govern the British Empire at its height. The legal traditions he established became the basis for legal systems that would eventually govern a quarter of the world's population. This adaptability reflected the essential genius of Edward's approach to governance, his recognition that lasting institutions must be based on practical necessity rather than abstract theory, that effective government requires the consent and cooperation of the governed, and that successful rulers must be willing to adapt their methods to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental objectives. The influence of Edward's reign can be traced through the subsequent history of the English-speaking world in countless ways. The American Constitution, with its balance of federal and state authority and its protection of individual rights, reflected principles that had their origins in Edward's parliamentary experiments. The Westminster system of government that spread throughout the British Empire and continues to operate in dozens of countries around the world had its roots in the representative institutions that Edward developed as tools for effective royal administration. Even the English language itself bears the imprint of Edward's reign. The standardization of legal and administrative terminology that occurred during his rule contributed to the development of a unified English that could serve as the language of government throughout the realm. The legal concepts and governmental procedures that emerged from his reforms required new vocabulary and more precise definitions, contributing to the evolution of English into a language capable of expressing complex political and legal ideas with unprecedented clarity and precision. The global influence of English law, English institutions, and English concepts of governance that would characterize the modern era all had their origins in the innovations of Edward I's reign. From the courtrooms of colonial America to the parliamentary chambers of modern Australia, from the legal codes of India to the constitutional conventions of Canada, the influence of the English Justinian can be traced through 7 centuries of political and legal development. As we drift towards sleep in our comfortable modern world, surrounded by the institutions and protections that we often take for granted, it is worth remembering that many of the fundamental principles that govern our lives had their origins in the patient work of a medieval king who understood that lasting power comes not from the sword alone, but from the creation of institutions that serve the needs and reflect the values of the people they govern. Edward I was indeed the king who built England, not just through his military conquests and administrative reforms, but through his creation of legal, political, and governmental traditions that would prove strong enough to spread across the globe and adaptable enough to survive the transformation from medieval monarchy to modern democracy. His legacy reminds us that individual leadership, however flawed, can create institutions and establish principles that outlive their creators and continue to shape the world for centuries to come. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Edward I is not the simple tomb that marks his resting place in Westminster Abbey, but the vast edifice of law, government, and political tradition that he constructed during his 35 years on the throne. That invisible monument has proved more durable than any castle, more influential than any military victory, and more lasting than any dynasty. It stands today as a testament to the power of ideas and institutions to transcend their origins and continue shaping human society long after their creators have passed into history. As the gentle whispers of medieval England fade into the darkness of sleep, we can rest peacefully knowing that the foundations of our modern world were laid by men and women who, despite their flaws and limitations, managed to create something greater than themselves, institutions and principles that continue to serve us well, even as we dream of the future they help to make possible.